FBI detective, this video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 426. No money, no way to move forward. Scar on Caroline's back. Living in this world, you may not be able to survive with only money, but you can't survive without money. Since the Federation went to Europe to investigate Javara's disappearance, Caroline paid for 80% of the food, clothing, housing, transportation and actions of Roan and the other two. Mona really doesn't have much money, but Roan is rich. But in order to cover up his identity, the money in the account in the Federation cannot be touched at all. On the surface, there is a piano store near the famous luxury store gathering area of Goethe Square in Germany. Caroline, who also has investments in many companies, is indeed the richest of the three. So when leaving the Federation for Europe, Caroline took the initiative to propose that in the search for Javara, Roan would provide manpower, Mona would provide technology, and she would provide funds, and the distribution would be fair and reasonable. Then, Caroline discovered with a toothache that reality seemed to be different from the movie. There are also some spy movies in this world, in which the protagonists are not short of money and go wherever they want, as if they have never thought about the problem of money. But when the three of them went from Germany to Austria, and then from Austria back to Germany, Caroline was horrified to find that the money in her wallet had shrunk a lot. Monaco is a country that is famous for its high-end tourism, luxury homes and extremely high prices. Caroline knew that saving lives was more important, but seeing that the money in her account might be cleared or even become negative, she couldn't help but raise her hand and asked her question. Mona fell silent after hearing this. This was indeed a problem. She subconsciously turned her head to look at Roan. She didn't know how much money Roan had, but he was definitely richer than her. Roan thought for a moment and was about to speak when Mona suddenly remembered something and clapped her hands. She then started typing on the computer keyboard and finally laughed and said, "You two, I found something." "What?" "This guy Bernakov Robert has been surrounded by more than a dozen bodyguards since he was injured. We can't seem to get close to him at all. But this guy goes to the Monte Carlo casino in Monaco to play for a whole day every 2 days." Mona looked up at Roan after she finished speaking. Roan grinned and looked at Caroline. "It sounds like good news. This time we can not only solve the problem of money, but also the problem of people. Monaco is one of the richest countries in the world. The gambling industry is the pillar industry of the country. The famous Monte Carlo casino is a combination of classicism and Baroque style. It looks as luxurious as a palace, with Greek-style stone columns and complicated stone carvings. It is extremely brilliant under the light. The decoration inside the casino is even more like a royal palace, with marble floors, crystal lamps, embroidered fabrics, German furniture, Asian silk, and Italian artworks. These interior decorations make the Monte Carlo casino comparable to the noble clubs or royal palaces in Paris and Berlin. In order to highlight the luxurious temperament of its casino, the early Monte Carlo casino did not entertain passers-by. Invitation tickets were required to participate in gambling, and gamblers needed to wear formal clothes. Men wore suits and ties, and women wore evening gowns. Not long after, this rule disappeared in history, but the habit of suits and dresses remained. After 2 days of field investigation and reconnaissance, it was determined that Bernakov Robert would go to the Monte Carlo casino from noon today to tomorrow morning. Roan carefully formulated a plan of action and then began to act. First, Roan asked Mona to get a fake identity for Caroline, from Europe to South America to Africa and even to the East, layer by layer, so that people could not find out Caroline's true identity in a short time. Then, Roan asked Caroline to let her write a letter in Russian, in the identity of a down-and-out noble, requesting a meeting with Bernakov Robert, and then asked Mona to disguise her identity and go to Bernakov Robert's residence to deliver it to his secretary. Soon, the other party rejected Caroline's request for a meeting. Although the secretary did not directly mock Mona, her tone was not good. In a hotel room in Monaco, Caroline, who had bought an expensive and high-end dark red dress, put the dress into the bedroom. Seeing Mona, who returned empty-handed and looked unhappy. She whispered, "So, we failed." On the contrary, it was a success. Roan put the newly bought high-end black suit aside, smiled and shook his head, walked to the table, picked up a few pieces of paper, handed them to Caroline, and said, "This is your identity tonight. You must remember it well. Then, come and sit on the chair. I need to draw something on your back." "What do you mean?" Caroline asked, but still took the paper and sat on the chair in front of Roan. Just as she was about to lower her head to check, a tingling sensation suddenly came from the back of her right shoulder, which scared Caroline so much that she screamed and jumped up subconsciously. "Don't move." Mona walked in front of Caroline, pressed her shoulders, and pushed Caroline back to the chair, smiling and saying, "Roan needs to draw a scar on your shoulder. This is your disguise for tonight." Looking back at the sharp needle in Roan's hand, Caroline swallowed her saliva and asked with trembling lips, "Are you sure this is a painting? Not a tattoo? It won't stay on my body forever, right?" "Don't worry, I know you girls don't like scars. Believe me, this thing will disappear after washing and wiping with professional tools." Roan laughed. This is an ancient technology from the East that the old killer taught him in his previous life. It looks lifelike in a short time. Afterwards, it is cleaned with a fixed ratio of medicine and recuperated for a few days, and no trace will be left. But if it is not cleaned within 48 hours, this thing will remain on the body, and it will be very troublesome and time consuming to get rid of it. Okay. Caroline swallowed her saliva and chose to believe Luo An. After a few seconds, she got used to the slight stinging feeling and relaxed her brows. She lowered her head and carefully read the contents of the paper. Tonight, Caroline is a woman named Godunova Evdoki from Eastern Europe. Her ancestors were surviving Russian nobles. Over the generations, her family has saved a lot of money and has some shady industries in Eastern Europe. Because of something her subordinates did some time ago, she learned about Bernakov Robert's identity. This time she came to Monaco to discuss cooperation with him. Not long after, Roan finished his work. Caroline stood up and looked through the mirror. She saw the scar nearly 10 centimeters behind her right shoulder. The corner of her mouth twitched. Does it really need to be that long? When a beautiful woman wears an elegant backless long dress, but has a long scar on her back, she will definitely attract everyone's attention. People will be moved and curious, wanting to know where the scar came from. And when all attention is focused on one thing, other things will be ignored. Roan stood up, put away the tools, and handed them to Mona, walked to Caroline, looked at her in the mirror and smiled. "You are the boss tonight, responsible for attracting attention and diverting attention. I'm your subordinate, responsible for gambling, and through gambling I contacted Bernakov Robert, and got the opportunity to meet him alone. Mona is observing and keeping watch outside, and is also responsible for meeting us." What a thoughtful man. Caroline pulled up her shirt to cover her shoulders, rolled her eyes at Roan, and then took the papers back to the bedroom. "I'll memorize them, but I don't have much money. Don't lose it all tonight, or I'll go to the Federation later and eat and drink with you." The bedroom door of the suite was closed. Roan laughed and ignored Caroline. He walked to Mona, put his arms around her, and kissed her on the face. "Are you angry?" "A little bit." Mona glared at Roan, bit his lips, and then said with a worried look on her face, "Are you sure tonight? If not, let's change the plan. Trust me, no problem." Roan lowered his head to cover Mona's lips and gave her a long kiss. Then Roan stopped and whispered in Mona's ear, "By the way, I need you to prepare something tonight." Huh? Mona was slightly stunned, and then after listening to Roan's words, her eyes moved slightly, and she nodded silently. Time soon arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. According to the plan, Roan and Caroline changed their clothes, drove a sports car, and went to the magnificent Monte Carlo casino. Chapter 427. Double funds. Poker table players of different statuses. In Monaco, there is no shortage of luxury cars and sports cars on the streets. Bugatti, Ferrari LaFerrari, Pagani, 765 LT, F50, Porsche 918, etc. can be seen everywhere. Compared with these cars, the Lamborghini that Roan and Caroline drove this time is not really conspicuous. Fortunately, the color of the Lamborghini that Roan drove this time was red, and the bright color still attracted a lot of people's attention. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, many people had gathered at the Monte Carlo casino. When the red Lamborghini stopped at the entrance of the casino, it was not particularly eye-catching. But the handsome Roan got out of the driver's seat, stretched out his hand, and pulled out a woman wearing an expensive dark red dress. Her face was disguised, but also very delicate. She had a proud figure with a large white back. When Caroline got out of the car, she immediately attracted a lot of people to stop and look at her, especially when they saw the long scar on Caroline's shoulder. Everyone gasped. Some men looked pretty, some women looked admiring, and of course many people frowned and looked away. Caroline's originally arrogant personality helped a lot at this time. She didn't care about those who looked down on her scar, as if those people were trash. She had no interest in paying attention to them. After Roan threw the car keys to the doorman, she took Roan straight into the casino. Roan pretended to be Caroline's subordinate this time, so he was one step behind Caroline all the way, perfectly playing the role of a bodyguard. Not in a hurry to participate in gambling, the two went to the bar on the second floor first. Caroline sat and Roan stood beside her. Feeling that many people here turned their eyes to the scar on her back, Caroline chuckled, handed Roan a glass of wine, and whispered, "It seems that your plan is very successful." Roan took the glass and thanked him, smiling, and whispered, "Because you are beautiful. Humans don't like beautiful things to have cracks, right?" Caroline chuckled and took a sip of wine. She glanced at the card tables downstairs and upstairs and asked, "What are you going to do next?" This time, the two of them entered the casino with a total of $2.4 million. Among them, $500,000 came from Caroline, and the rest was the money Roan got from the overseas account in the murder of the second team leader and several other cases. But every time Bernakoff Robert participated in the gambling game on the third floor of the casino, it was a minimum of $5 million, with no upper limit. So Roan needed to get $2.6 million in a short time before he could go to the third floor and participate in the gambling game where Bernakoff Robert was. Caroline knew that gambling was a game of probability where the dealer would win. Although she had seen Roan playing cards from a distance in Las Vegas before, she really didn't know where Roan got his confidence from. Roan grinned, picked up the wine glass, and drank it all, and put the glass back on the bar. "You are right. Gambling is indeed not a good thing. No one can win all the time, and gamblers will not have a good ending." Facing Caroline's question, Roan said a few words casually, but did not answer. He just gave her a look, then took the chips, and walked straight to the 5-card stud gambling table not far away. The scientific name is 5-card stud, which is a kind of poker game. The arrangement and combination of 5 cards determine the winner. At the beginning of the game, each player will be dealt a whole card. This card can only be turned over at the end. When the second card is distributed, the player with the better hand will decide the bet amount, and others have the right to choose call, raise, give up, or clear the bottom. After the 5 cards were dealt, each player turned over all the cards to compare the size. The biggest one was the winner. Luo An himself did not like gambling. When he was still young in his previous life, the old killer played cards with him once. At that time, the two did not compare money, but who lost, and who was whipped. Luo An had some losses in the first few times, but winning was the main thing. Later, Luo An, who was sure that he would win the game, increased the bet, and increased the whip to 50. As a result, the old killer cheated, and Luo An lost miserably. He was directly whipped by 50 whips. Since then, Luo An knew that gambling was not about cards, but about people outside the game, so he never touched cards again. If he had not had the emotional perception in his mind in this life, which could sense the different emotional fluctuations of other people when they got different cards, Luo An would probably never walk into the casino to participate in the game in this life. And even with emotional perception, Luo An was very careful. He first guessed, then tried, and then verified. He took every step very cautiously. He chose to give up if he felt something was wrong, and never took risks. So Caroline, who stood by holding a wine glass and watching, felt as if her heart was on a roller coaster. At the beginning, Luo An lost 4 out of 5 games, then slowly lost 3 out of 5 games and won 2, and then lost 1 out of 5 games and won 4. Caroline's breathing was slightly short, Her heartbeat accelerated, and her face was much rosier than when she first came. 3 hours later, at 6:30 p.m., Luo An successfully increased his chips from 2.4 million to 6.7 million amid the envious and jealous eyes of everyone, then apologized and left, and went to the restaurant with Caroline to enjoy dinner. In the booth, Caroline held Luo An's hand tightly and asked in disbelief, "How did you do it? How did you do it? Control your emotions, Caroline." Luo An stared at Caroline's eyes and said in a firm voice, "Don't forget the goal of our trip, okay? Okay." Seeing the stern look in Luo An's eyes, Caroline's breathing stagnated due to the excitement of adrenaline and dopamine soaring, and she quickly shifted her eyes and let go of Luo An's hand. She sat on the other side, took a few deep breaths, and gradually calmed down. She felt some discomfort and her face stiffened. She apologized to Luo An in a low voice, then got up and went to the bathroom. A moment later, Caroline returned to the box. The dishes were served. Luo An extended his hand to ask her to eat first and then discuss what to do next. But Caroline grabbed Luo An's arm. "Luo An, something new has happened." Luo An was slightly stunned. "What do you mean? I saw someone familiar." Caroline's face was not looking good. She said that she had just come out of the bathroom and saw Mrs. Hanover and a few people walking into the restaurant, talking and laughing. "Mrs. Hanover?" Roan frowned slightly when he heard this. Caroline asked nervously, "Is she in the same group with Bernakoff Robert?" Roan pondered for a while and shook his head slowly. "Not very likely." Caroline was about to say something when Roan pushed her down on the chair and said with a smile, "No matter what, let's finish the meal first. This meal costs nearly $20,000 US." Hearing this, Caroline's eyes widened instantly. She rolled her eyes at Roan and quickly lowered her head to taste the food. Half an hour later, Caroline, comforted by Roan, returned to being the proud woman again. She and Roan walked into a large room on the 3rd floor of the casino. In the center of the room with a low-key and restrained decoration style, there was a large gambling table. In the center of the left side of the gambling table, sat a dealer wearing a black women's suit, white gloves, and an expressionless face. She looked to be in her 30s. In the other directions of the gambling table, there were 5 men and women playing cards. Roan and Caroline's target, Bernakoff Robert, was sitting on the far left of the table, while Mrs. Hanover was sitting in the center of the right side of the table, with a large pile of chips in front of her. Unlike Caroline, Roan's eyes were not on Mrs. Hanover or Bernakoff Robert, but on the other 3 players at the table. Roan had asked Mona to investigate the people who often appeared at the table. Among the 3, there was a blonde man in a suit, a white woman in a blue dress, and an African-looking man with a gold Rolex. Roan selectively ignored the African-looking man. According to Mona's investigation, the other man and woman were from the United Kingdom and suspected to be MI6, and the woman was from the Commonwealth and suspected to be CIA. Soon, the African-looking man lost a lot and stopped playing and turned to leave the room. Roan did not hesitate, took the chips, and walked up to the table and sat in this position. Seeing Bernakoff Robert, Mrs. Hanover, a woman who looked like a CIA, and a man who looked like a MI6 all turning their eyes to him, Luo An chuckled, raised his glass towards them, and asked with a smile, "You don't mind, do you?" Chapter 428. The game begins. Sherry, gin, and vodka. On the 3rd floor of the Monte Carlo Casino, there is a room decorated in the style of the last century in Europe. There is a huge oval card table in the center of the room, and the dealer sits on the side of the long straight line. Bernakoff Robert, wearing a black suit and light blue eyes, sits on the leftmost arc of the card table. On the straight card table opposite the dealer, from left to right are a white woman named Perna, who is suspected to be from the CIA, Mrs. Hanover, and a blonde white man named Vincent, who is suspected to be from MI6. Roan is sitting on the rightmost arc of the card table, facing Bernakoff Robert from a distance, and Vincent is on his left. Seeing Roan pick up the wine glass, Bernakoff Robert smiled slightly and lowered his head to sort out the chips. Mrs. Hanover glanced at Roan and withdrew her gaze expressionlessly. Vincent did not speak. Perna knocked on the table and urged, "Can we start?" Roan glanced at the chips in front of Perna and found that she had lost the most and had already lost half. Mrs. Hanover followed closely behind and lost a lot, but she didn't care. Please draw your cards and determine the dealer based on the size of the cards. The game played on this table was Texas Hold'em with some minor adjustments. The dealer dealt 5 cards to the 5 people on the table. The 5 people showed their cards one by one. Mrs. Hanover had the highest card. The dealer took back the cards and nodded. Mrs. Hanover is the dealer. Please place your bet. Mrs. Hanover was a little lazy. She picked up a red chip and threw it on the table. The dealer said, Mrs. Hanover will place a small blind bet of 10,000. Soon, the dealer dealt the cards again. 10 cards were placed on the table and distributed to the 5 people one by one. Luo An picked up his 2 cards and took a look at them casually. His expression did not change. He began to use emotion perception to feel the emotions of others. Soon, the first game ended. Luo An stopped betting midway and lost 500,000. Caroline, who was not far away, did not change her expression on her face, but her eyes moved slightly. After a few rounds, Roan lost nearly $3 million. The $2,400,000 he had when he entered the casino today had been completely lost. Caroline, who was sitting at the bar not far away, stopped looking at who was winning and who was losing at the table in order to avoid revealing her flaws. Instead, she started chatting quietly with the woman brought by Bernakov. Penna, who had been losing at the table, won several times from Roan. Not only did his anxiety begin to disappear, but he also smiled at Roan. Bernakov and Vincent also won several rounds. Mrs. Hanover saw Roan losing all the time and frowned slightly. Then her expression remained unchanged, and she continued to bet, as if nothing had happened. A new round of poker began. The dealer dealt 2 poker cards to each of the 5 people. The first, second, third and fourth rounds of betting ended quickly. 5 lit poker cards appeared in front of the dealer himself. All 5 players at the table followed to the last round. The betting is over. The 5 people finished betting, and the chips in the middle of the table had accumulated to 11 million. The dealer spread his hands and said, everyone, please show your cards. Penna, whose face flushed with excitement, was the first to show her cards. Her 2 whole cards and the 5 community cards in front of the dealer just formed a straight. But unfortunately, Vincent's cards and Mrs. Hanover's cards were both bigger than Penna's. And Bernakov's cards were bigger than Mrs. Hanover's. The ups and downs of life and death made Penna look very ugly, and Vincent's face was also very ugly. Mrs. Hanover's expression remained unchanged, and she didn't care about the money she lost at all. Just like Bernakov, she turned her eyes to Roan. After 4 rounds of betting, Luo An only had more than 1 million chips left, and the rest were all on the gambling table. If he lost this time, unless Luo An's cards in the next round were the largest and rarest royal flush, the chance of Luo An leaving the gambling table was very high. Bernakov also stared at Luo An closely. In this round, his cards were 4 cards of the same number, which was the largest card on the table. It was not easy to beat him. In the eyes of everyone with different expressions, Luo An laughed and pushed his cards to the dealer. The dealer turned over Luo An's 2 cards, combined these 2 cards with the 5 public cards on the table, and said in a calm voice, "Flush, Mr. Brian, Luo An's new alias, has the largest card. The game is over. Collect the cards." After confirming that all parties had no objections, the dealer collected the cards on the table and pushed all the chips on the table to Luo An. In this round, Penna, Vincent, Mrs. Hanover and Bernakov lost more than 2.5 million respectively. Roan not only won back his principal, but also earned more than 3 million. Shit. Penna, who lost again, cursed in a low voice, then raised his hand and said loudly, "Bartender, give me a glass of Gordon's gin, with ice." Vincent next to him heard the words and said loudly, "Same." Mrs. Hanover and Bernakov didn't say anything. Roan looked at the 2 of them, and then looked at Caroline, who was sitting at the bar chatting with others, but had been listening to the situation here. He smiled slightly, and said to the bartender, 3 parts of sherry, 1 part of gin, 1 part of vodka, 1 part of tequila, shake with ice, and add lemon slices. "Okay, sir." The bartender's mouth twitched when he heard this. It was the first time he heard such a cocktail request, but his good professionalism made him not question it, and immediately nodded and agreed. Soon, the intermission was over, and after the bartender brought all the drinks that the people had ordered to the table, a new round of poker games began again. In the next few poker games, Luo An had some wins and some losses, but he mainly won. Mrs. Hanover, Vincent, and Perna basically didn't win much, and Bernakov won more times than Luo An. Time passed by minute, and more than 2 hours later, Vincent lost all his chips of 10 million, left the poker table with a gloomy face, and sat down at the bar to chat with people. Mrs. Hanover also lost a full 17 million, but she still had 10 million chips in front of her, so she still sat lazily in the chair, her expression unchanged, as if she didn't care about winning or losing at all. Perna lost all her chips faster than Vincent, but after losing the first 9 million, she left the room for a moment, and soon returned to the gambling table with 12 million chips and her head held high. This scene attracted the attention of everyone in the room, and even Luo An couldn't help but look at her twice more. Roan didn't know whether the money was from Perna himself or the CIA. If it was the latter, then the CIA was indeed rich and powerful. At the poker table, only 2 people won money, namely Roan and Bernakov. Bernakov's original capital was relatively large, a full 20 million. Adding the money he won from others, the chips in front of him have accumulated to about 48 million. However, Bernakov with light blue eyes was not the most eye-catching one. Roan, who sat opposite him, and occasionally took a sip of wine, attracted the most attention of the onlookers in the room. Roan had the least capital among the 5 people at the beginning, only $6.7 million. But now, Roan has several layers of thick and high chips stacked in front of him, adding up to a full 34 million. A new round of poker started, and the 4 rounds of betting ended. Perna stopped betting in the middle. Only Roan, Bernakov and Mrs. Hanover followed to the end. The chips in the middle of the poker table accumulated to 30 million. Mrs. Hanover was still lazily leaning on the chair. Bernakov narrowed his eyes and stared at Roan. Roan took a sip from the wine glass. The dealer laid out the 5 public cards and said, "Please show your cards, all 3 of you." Chapter 429, all in, 152 million, Mantis and Cicada. At the card table, the dealer finished speaking, and Mrs. Hanover showed her cards first, followed by Roan, and the last one to show his cards was Bernakov. Mrs. Hanover had the smallest card, Roan had the second largest card, and Bernakov had the largest card. Bernakov, who had the largest card, glanced at Roan, smiled slightly, and took the 30 million US dollars in chips in the middle of the table. XN Perna saw this scene, and muttered a few words in a low voice, urging the dealer to start the next game quickly. Mrs. Hanover glanced at Roan, frowned slightly, and changed her posture. Roan's breathing changed slightly, glanced at Bernakov, and took a sip of the wine glass again. A few games ended quickly, and Perna had almost lost all the 12 million chips she had just brought, and there was not much left of the 27 million that Mrs. Hanover brought. Unlike Perna, who looked impatient and fidgety, Mrs. Hanover's expression did not change at all. She raised her hand and yawned, asked the bartender for a glass of French cordon bleu, and then lazily looked at the other 2 people at the card table. At this time, Bernakov had 65 million chips in front of him, and Roan had 54 million chips in front of him. The money lost by everyone in the whole game was held by the 2 of them. A new round of the game began, and the dealer dealt 2 cards to each of the 4 people. After the 3rd round of betting ended, the dealer showed the 4th public card. She looked up at the 4 people and said in a calm voice, "The pot is now 14 million. Please bet." Perna thought about it and did not bet. Check. Mrs. Hanover also did not bet. Check. Bernakov and Roan made the same choice. The 2 looked at each other and chose to check. Everyone check. There are 4 players left in this round. The dealer repeated as usual, then laid out the 5th community card and said, "The 5th round begins. Please place your bets." Perna frowned slightly, picked up his 2 whole cards, and looked at them, and was silent for a few seconds, then pushed out 5 stacks of chips. "Bet, 5 million. The dealer repeated Perna's words, then looked at Mrs. Hanover. Mrs. Hanover pondered for a while, and pushed out all the 8 stacks of chips in front of her. All in, 8 million. All in, 8 million. The pot is 27 million. The dealer repeated Mrs. Hanover's choice, then turned to look at Bernakov. "Please place your bets." Bernakov looked at Roan, who was sitting opposite him, for a few seconds, chuckled, and pushed out 10 stacks of chips. Raise, 10 million. The pot is 37 million. The dealer looked at Roan. Please place your bets. Luo An ignored the dealer. He stared at Bernakov, who was sitting opposite him. He pondered for a while, then suddenly grinned, picked up the wine glass, and drank it all, and pushed all the chips in front of him out. 50 million, all in. Wow. Seeing Luo An's action, the crowd of onlookers at the gambling table suddenly burst into an uproar, and a buzzing sound instantly sounded. Vincent, who had already left the gambling table, stood up, and Caroline, who was sitting at the bar, could no longer sit still. Her face changed slightly, and she cast her eyes on the card table. 50 million, all in. The dealer repeated Roan's words, then turned to Perna. Do you want to call? Perna was a little confused. She looked down at her cards, then looked at Roan, who was smiling. After a few seconds of silence, she gritted her teeth, and pushed all the remaining chips in front of her. 5 million, call, all in. Mrs. Hanover went all in, Roan went all in, and Perna went all in. There was already a large pile of chips in the middle of the table, and everyone present turned their eyes to Bernakov. Bernakov, who had chosen to call in the previous round, never expected that Roan would go all in. For a moment, he couldn't tell whether Roan was bluffing him or was really confident. Bernakov's light blue eyes were closely watching Roan's every move sitting opposite him. Roan didn't care about the other's eyes, with a faint smile on his face, and in turn stared at Bernakov. At this time, the air in the room was extremely quiet, and everyone was waiting for Bernakov's choice. Bernakov was silent for a long time, then he suddenly smiled softly, and pushed all the chips in front of him out. 60 million, call, all in. 60 million, call, all in. The pot is 152 million. As soon as the dealer finished speaking, the audience at the gambling table gasped. It was still more than half a month before 2006, and the chips on the table were a real 152 million euros, a huge sum. At this time, the market value of many European companies was not so much. The dealer was a person who had seen the world, and her expression was still very calm. Gentlemen, ladies, please show your cards. At the table, a group of spectators stood on tiptoe and stretched their necks to try to figure out the situation of the 4 people's cards. Caroline did not look at the table like them, but turned around and looked down at her wine glass, as if the lemon slice in the wine glass was more interesting. However, her left hand with white knuckles showed that she was far from being so calm. At the card table, Mrs. Hanover looked at Roan deeply, and without any nonsense, she was the first to reveal her 2 cards, which just happened to form a flush with the 5 community cards. Perna smiled and immediately pushed her 2 whole cards to the dealer, who opened them and said in a calm voice, 3 8s, a pair of J's, a boat card, greater than a flush. Perna raised her head and looked at Roan and Bernakov with a smile. Bernakov smiled and pushed his cards to the dealer. The dealer opened the 2 cards and arranged them with the 5 cards on the table and said in a calm voice, 3 J's, a pair of 10s, a larger boat card. Perna's eyes widened instantly when she saw this scene. Bernakov completely ignored her, just glanced at the audience around him, then spread his hands to Roan and smiled faintly. It's your turn. The smile on Roan's face slowly disappeared. Mrs. Hanover frowned at this. Caroline, who was sitting at the bar not far away, still didn't turn around, but just tightened her grip on the wine glass. The air in the whole room was extremely quiet. The onlookers didn't dare to breathe. Seeing that Roan didn't smile, all kinds of thoughts and expressions suddenly appeared on their faces. After a few seconds of silence, Roan looked around and suddenly laughed and handed his cards to the dealer. The dealer opened the 2 cards and arranged them with the 5 public cards on the table. He said in a calm voice, 7, 8, 9, 10, J, all spades, straight flush, greater than the boat card. Jesus. How is it possible? Straight flush. Seeing this scene, the onlookers all widened their eyes and exclaimed. Caroline, who was at the edge of the bar, let out a long breath, relaxed, turned around, and returned to her original arrogant appearance. At the card table, Bernakov looked at Roan with a cold face for a few seconds, got up and left the card table without saying anything. Perna slammed the table hard, glared at Roan fiercely, and followed him out of the room. Mrs. Han overlooked at Roan with interest for a moment, and also left the card table and walked out. Well done. Caroline walked slowly to Roan's side, handed him a glass of wine, and after praising him, she looked at the pile of chips on the table that belonged to them, her eyes shining a little, and asked in a low voice, "What should we do next?" My original idea was to take advantage of the end of the card game to have a private contact with Bernakov. Looking at the guests gradually walking out of the room, Roan's eyes flashed with a strange color, and he smiled softly. But now this plan needs to be changed temporarily. This room is full of talents. Let's wait a few minutes, wait until the mantis and the cicada are almost done, and then we will enter. Caroline. Sorry, today's 2 chapters are posted in reverse, and we are contacting to modify them. I'm really sorry. Oh, Chapter 430, Sudden Explosion, New Game. If you lose, your hand will be chopped off. Monte Carlo Casino. A card game with a pot of 152 million was not a common occurrence even in the Monte Carlo Casino in 2005. When the news of this card game spread to the first and second floors of the casino, everyone was extremely curious and wanted to know who won such a big card game. Among them, those who were more informed, after learning that the winner was a woman with a delicate face and a good figure, but with a scar on her shoulder. Those who were more active in thinking immediately had all kinds of ideas. But to everyone's disappointment, Caroline and Roan did not go downstairs after winning the card game. After having someone exchange the chips, the two asked for a room for temporary rest and walked in. Caroline sat on the sofa, her eyes shining as she looked at the more than 100 million euros in the newly opened bank account. Luo An closed the curtains, stood in front of the window, gently parted the gap in the curtains, carefully observed the situation downstairs, and took out his mobile phone to call Mona. Mona, the original plan is temporarily cancelled. I will notify you of the follow-up situation. What? In a car outside the casino, Mona was stunned when she heard this. She wanted to ask why, but she was used to trusting Luo An, and suppressed her doubts, and nodded in agreement. Luo An smiled softly when he saw this. He knew that Mona had doubts, so he briefly talked about the situation of Perna, Vincent, and a group of bystanders in the casino, and explained, when we were playing cards just now, almost 2/3 of the people in the room were going for Bernakov. We don't need to compete with them for people for the time being. Okay. Mona was speechless when she heard this. Caroline, who knew Chinese on the sofa, also figured out what Luo An meant by the mantis and cicada. Caroline thought about it. She still had a question. Just as she was about to speak, she suddenly heard a deafening explosion. Boom. The explosion resounded through the sky, so sudden that the entire casino building seemed to shake. The players in the casino were startled, and many of them subconsciously crawled under the card table. After the others reacted, they immediately screamed and ran out of the casino. The entire casino suddenly became extremely chaotic. Some people ran away, some called to inquire about the situation, and some took advantage of the chaos to steal the chips that no one wanted, especially the big ones. Roan, who was standing in front of the window, did not expect the explosion. Seeing the flames rising into the sky and the subsequent black and grey smoke rising from the direction of the parking lot outside the casino, Roan quickly picked up the phone and asked, "Mona, are you okay?" "I'm fine." On the roadside not too far from the parking lot, Mona, who was also startled, looked at the several cars burning in the parking lot a few dozen meters away, and frowned. "Roan, if I'm not mistaken, the exploded car belongs to Bernakov." In the room, Caroline, who was trembling with fear from the explosion just now, quickly came to Roan. Hearing Mona's voice on the phone, Caroline covered her mouth with surprise on her face. "Is this a case of silencing or something? Who did it? MI6 or CIA? The only one who dares to do things so unscrupulously in other countries can be the CIA." Mona on the other end of the phone thought about it, and suddenly frowned. "But is Mrs. Hanover also coming for Bernakov? She didn't do it, did she?" "No, not them." After a few seconds of hesitation, Roan suddenly took Caroline's hand and walked towards the door, saying as he walked, "I'm afraid it was Bernakov's own doing. None of these people are simple. They all have their own ideas." Mona and Caroline were stunned when they heard this. The situation was urgent, so Roan didn't have time to explain in detail. He quickly asked Mona to resume the original plan through his mobile phone. Then he lowered his head and whispered a few words in Caroline's ear and finally walked to the room on the other side of the 3rd floor with Caroline. At the door of a room with a dark red door, Roan knocked on the door. A few seconds later, a white strong man in a black suit walked out. Caroline stood expressionlessly at the back. Roan looked at the sturdy man with a smile and said, Monsieur Doki, Caroline's pseudonym, chapter 245, asked to meet with Mr. Bernakov. The white sturdy man glanced at Roan and replied expressionlessly, sorry, Mr. Bernakov is not here. He has left. Monsieur Doki sent her secretary to contact Mr. Bernakov by letter before, but Mr. Bernakov refused. Roan laughed and continued nonchalantly, we have a way to solve the problem Mr. Bernakov is facing, but the premise is that Mr. Bernakov is willing to pay us another 150 million euros. Roan's words first explained to Bernakov that we contacted you before and wanted to cooperate with you, but you didn't meet with us, so I came to the casino to win your money. Second, it revealed their identities and showed that they were not in the same group with certain people. The white sturdy man's expression did not change after hearing this, and he still said that Bernakov was not here. Caroline turned away expressionlessly. Roan smiled at the white man and quickly turned around to follow him. Walking back to the room where the two were just now, Caroline whispered, are you sure this will work? Not sure. But if it doesn't work, I have other ways. Roan laughed. Caroline frowned slightly when she heard that, because until the two opened the door and walked into the room, the white man didn't catch up and call them. After closing the door, Caroline turned to look at Roan and spread her hands. So, this time it failed. What is your next plan? No hurry, wait another 60 seconds. Roan shook his head, then looked down at Caroline's slender thighs and asked with a smile, are all the things still there? Caroline rolled her eyes at Roan. Of course, it's a little uncomfortable. It's always like this for the first time. You'll get used to it. Dung. 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 The corner of Caroline's mouth moved slightly, and just as she was about to complain, there was a knock on the door next to the two. Giving Caroline a look, Roan walked over and opened the door. Outside was a beautiful woman in a silver dress. She smiled at Roan and said, my boss wants to see you. Please follow me. Roan didn't rush to agree, but asked, is your boss ready for the 150 million euros that Monsieur Doki wants? The woman in the silver dress froze a little when she heard this, but soon returned to normal and replied with a smile, that depends on Monsieur Doki's ability. Roan looked at the woman in the silver dress for a few seconds, then turned to look at Caroline, perfectly playing the role of a subordinate. Caroline got up from the sofa, glanced at the woman in the silver dress, and said in a light voice, lead the way. The woman in the silver dress smiled slightly and quickly stretched out her hand to the left to lead the way for Caroline and Roan. Soon, the two were taken to a room on the 4th floor of the casino. The woman in the silver dress pushed the door open, and Roan and Caroline were greeted not by Bernakov, but by several strong men in black. The other party held out his hand to stop Roan, saying that they wanted to search Roan for weapons. Roan opened his arms without a care, allowing the other party to search him. He had nothing on him, so the search was over quickly. But when the woman in the silver dress examined Caroline, she found a pocket pistol and a folding dagger on the inside of Caroline's thigh. Facing the distrustful look of the woman in the silver dress, Caroline followed Roan's previous teachings and said calmly, I'm a woman, and it is reasonable for me to hide a pistol and a dagger on my thigh. The woman in the silver dress was silent for a few seconds, and then she accepted this answer and continued to lead the two of them into the depths of the room. Pushing open a door, Roan and Caroline finally saw Bernakov. Bernakov, with light blue eyes, saw the two of them chuckle, pointed to the card table in front of him and said, good evening, Monsieur Doki. Mr. Brian, I didn't expect that we would meet again so soon. The previous card game was not satisfying enough. How about we play another round? But let's change the bet this time. We won't bet on money. Whoever loses will have a hand chopped off. Hearing the word chopped off hand, Caroline's eyes moved slightly, and she recalled Javara's severed hand. Chapter 431 Negotiation. Jumping from the building, screaming Caroline. On the 4th floor of the Monte Carlo casino, in a room deep inside a room, Robert Bernakov sat on a chair with his back against the window, with a large gambling table in front of him. On both sides of Bernakov's back, and at the left and right corners of the door, there stood 4 bodyguards in black suits, expressionless, holding pistols, staring at Roan and Caroline. Hearing the word broken hand, it is hard not to think of Joela's broken hand. However, Caroline reacted quickly and replied coldly, "You can play games and gamble. But Mr. Bernakov, are you sure you want to play cards at this time? There is a group of people waiting for you outside." Hearing Caroline's words, Bernakov laughed, threw the cards in his hand aside, and said, "Ms. Yevdokia's words make sense. Please sit down." Caroline sat down, and Roan stood behind her. A bodyguard came forward and poured 2 cups of coffee for Caroline and Bernakov. Bernakov took a sip and said bluntly, "I wonder if Miss Yevdokia has any suggestions?" According to Roan's previous teachings, Caroline said in a light voice, "It's very simple. Throw the blame on others." Caroline said that, since your organization has 3 responsible persons in Europe, and MI6 and CIA have also set their sights on Bernakov, then Bernakov can completely blame one of the other 2 responsible persons, indicating that the person in charge is the mastermind and Bernakov is just helping. At that time, Bernakov can get rid of the person in charge with the help of CIA and MI6, which will not only get rid of the trouble, but also expand his sphere of influence, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Of course, Bernakov is now being watched by CIA and MI6, and it is a bit difficult for him to do this alone, so Caroline can help as a third party. However, there is no free lunch in the world. After this matter is resolved, Bernakov needs to give Caroline the business in Eastern Europe, and Caroline also wants half of the business of the person in charge. Snap, snap, snap. After hearing Caroline's words, Bernakov's eyes moved slightly, and he smiled and clapped his hands. "I didn't expect Miss Yevdokia to have such a big appetite at such a young age. When I was young, my father died early, and most of the family business was taken away by some people." Caroline smiled slightly, folded her hands on her legs, and said in a calm voice, "But I was not angry at the time, because I knew that those people would manage the stolen business well. Sure enough, when I grew up, the value of those businesses had increased tenfold, so I took them back one by one. To express my gratitude, I sent those who took away my business and their entire families to meet my father, so that my father could express his gratitude to them in person." Hearing this, Bernakov's smile became even bigger, but he did not agree immediately, and then asked, "Then Miss Yevdokia, how do I know if you can do what you said?" Bernakov is still not sure whether Caroline's words are true or false, but since the other party dares to say so, he doesn't mind taking advantage of the other party. Caroline's expression did not change after hearing this. Following Roan's plan, she waved her hand, took a sip of the coffee on the table, and said softly, "Brian." "Okay, miss." Roan nodded, smiled at Bernakov, then turned and walked to the left side of the door, where a bodyguard with a gun was standing. He looked up and stared at the other person for a second. Roan grinned and punched the other person in the chest. Bang! Roan's movements were too fast, and his strength was huge. The bodyguard didn't react at all, and was knocked back, and hit the wall. Roan took the opportunity to grab the other person's right hand holding the gun, aimed the gun at the bodyguard on the right side of the door, and pulled the trigger directly. Bang! The bodyguard, who also didn't react, was shot in the head. The 2 bodyguards at the window finally reacted at this time, raised their weapons, aimed at Roan, and shot. Bang bang bang. Roan moved himself behind the bodyguard in his hand in a flash, using him as a cover, raised the pistol, and swept it left and right, and pulled the trigger at a very fast speed. Bang, 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 bang. 4 gunshots were heard, and the 2 bodyguards at the window fell to the ground. Luo An let go of the unlucky guy who was shot dead by his teammates, walked quickly to the door, picked up a chair, and held the door handle firmly. All this happened too quickly. In the blink of an eye, the 4 bodyguards lost their breath. Bernakov's expression suddenly changed. He stood up and grabbed Caroline's hand, took out a gun, and pointed it at her head. "Ms. Yevdokia, what do you mean? Who are you? You'll know after a good night's sleep." Bang! Luo An raised his hand and fired a shot, hitting Bernakov's hand holding the gun accurately. The other party fell to the ground in pain. Without waiting for Bernakov, who was full of anger, to speak, Luo An quickly moved to his side, took out a bottle of sleeping potion from behind his buttocks, opened his mouth, and poured it all in. Before this operation, Roan went to the pharmacy to buy some things. In front of Mona and Caroline, he pretended to mix some potions randomly, so Caroline was not confused by the sleeping potion that made Bernakov fall asleep quickly. But Caroline was shocked by another thing. She widened her eyes and asked, "Roan, how did you bring this thing in? Are those guys who searched you outside blind? Secret?" The gunshots in the room had attracted the attention of the bodyguards outside. They were knocking on the door. Roan blinked at Caroline without explaining. He pushed the unconscious Bernakov to Caroline and said, "Keep an eye on him. Call Mona, tell her our location, and ask her to go downstairs." Putting away the pistol and walking to the window, Roan pulled down the curtains and tore them into pieces. Soon they were tied into a long rope, one end of which was tied to the gambling table in the room, and the other end was tied to Roan's own waist. When tearing the curtains, Roan took out a bottle of featherfall potion and poured it into Caroline's stomach, while Caroline was not paying attention. Caroline, who was struggling to support Bernakov, was stunned when she saw that Roan only tied a rope for herself and asked in confusion, "Where's mine?" "What do you mean yours?" "Here, bite it." Stuffing a piece of curtain rag into Caroline's mouth, Roan kicked the window glass to pieces, then clamped Caroline with his left arm, Bernakov with his right arm, and the computer that Bernakov placed on the gambling table with his thighs, and directly jumped out of the window in front of Caroline's shocked face. It turned out that Roan still overestimated the role of the rags. The moment he jumped out of the window, Caroline screamed in fear, especially because time was too tight and the rope was not long enough. When the three of them were hanging on the second floor and couldn't go down, Caroline was even more scared and screamed even louder. At this time, Mona had parked the car downstairs and was ready. Roan loosened his right arm and threw the sleeping Bernakov and his computer onto the roof of Mona's car. According to the plan made before, Mona stuffed Bernakov into the car, took out a lifelike dummy from the car, and threw it on the ground, and finally drove away from the area quickly. Then Roan untied the rope around his waist and jumped directly to the ground holding Caroline. Bang! At the moment of landing smoothly, Caroline still closed her eyes and screamed, holding Roan tightly with both hands, and refused to let go. "They are there. Go downstairs. Go downstairs and catch them." At this moment, several heads suddenly appeared in the room upstairs and shouted. Roan raised his pistol and shot, and then patted Caroline's pretty face in his arms. "Stop screaming." Before Caroline could react, Roan picked up the dummy on the ground and stuffed it and Caroline into the backseat of another car prepared by Mona in advance. Then Roan got into the driver's seat and drove the car in the opposite direction of Mona. Bernakov's bodyguards drove behind him. The CIA and Mi-6, who were testing each other because of the explosion, heard about this, looked at each other, and drove to catch up. So on the streets of Monaco at night, tourists were stunned to see a car leading a dozen cars. Looking at the cars behind him that were closely following his car, Roan laughed. Under Caroline's horrified eyes, he operated the steering wheel with one hand and called Mona with the other hand. "How are you doing? It's going well here." In a basement, Mona was fiddling with Bernakov's computer and asked back, "How long will it take for you to finish?" Roan glanced at the rearview mirror, selectively ignored Caroline's terrified shouts, and said calmly, "Give me 5 minutes." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 432 F1 Racing, Luo An, jumping out of the car. Monaco, a world-renowned wealthy country, is also a world-renowned small country with a total area of only 0.8 square kilometers. Some villages with more people in a certain eastern country are larger than it. At the same time, Monaco also has one of the 4 shortest F1 tracks in the world. This track is integrated with the streets of Monaco City. The cars travel directly between the blocks at high speed. The residents of the city can see the F1 cars speeding past the windows when they look out of the windows. The F1 race is mostly held during the day. Tonight, we saw a car leading the race on the streets of Monaco, and many cars followed closely. Although the people and tourists on the roadside didn't know what happened, they still waved the food in their hands and screamed, applauded, and cheered in the mood of watching the excitement. Bernakov's bodyguards, CIA, and Mi-6 who were chasing Roan in a car, at *%. After hanging up the phone, Roan glanced at the rearview mirror, sneered, sat up straight, and said in a cold voice, "Sit tight, Caroline, I'm going to speed up." WTF. Caroline, whose lips had been trembling since she got in the Audi, felt her heart almost stopped when she heard this. She grabbed her seatbelt tightly and said in disbelief, "You want to speed up again? There's a turn ahead. You have to speed up when you get to the turn. Who doesn't speed up when driving in a straight line?" Roan laughed, stepped on the gas, turned the steering wheel, stepped on the brake, and pulled the handbrake. With a set of smooth movements, the black Audi left 2 long traces on the ground at an incredible angle amid the shock and cheers of passers-by, and then spun and jumped into another street. Fouquet. Brake. Brake. Son of. Among the dozen cars behind the Audi, the 3 drivers who were in the front and the most stubborn didn't react at all. They drove their cars into the roadside store amid the curses of their teammates. Bang. Boom. The fierce explosion was deafening. The 3 cars were put together one after another. The orange-red flames instantly illuminated the entire street. Many passers-by who reacted screamed and fled. But there were also a few middle-aged rich people who liked F1 and had come to Monaco to watch the F1 race. Seeing the scene of the cars behind slowing down and passing through the flames and continuing to chase the Audi car, their faces flushed with excitement and they shouted loudly, "This is called racing." Who is the owner of the Audi? Don't know? If you don't know, go check it out for me. I want to sign him. I want him to be the chief racer of my F1 team. Luo An didn't know that he was spotted by a few rich people who liked F1 racing. Even if he knew, he wouldn't care. He was closely observing the situation of the cars following him. After 4 consecutive sharp turns, Roan had successfully sent off 9 cars. The ones following behind also pulled away from the Audi for a long distance. Looking away from the rearview mirror, Roan confirmed that the road ahead was straight for a long time. Roan reached out and patted Caroline, saying, "Caroline, come to me quickly." What? Caroline, who was dizzy from the continuous high-speed turns of the car, did not react for a while. Seeing that she was a little confused, Roan simply didn't bother to explain. He quickly reached out and unfastened Caroline's seatbelt. Amid Caroline's screams, Roan hugged her to himself and said seriously in her ear, "Hold me tight. Don't let go." After that, without waiting for Caroline to answer, Roan took out a lighter from his pocket and threw it directly at the dummy in the back seat of the car. The dummy, that had been painted with something in advance, burned up instantly when it came into contact with the flame. Luo An opened the windows on both sides of the back seat, and billowing smoke and flames instantly came out of the windows. In the eyes of others, this Audi car seemed to be pulling the flames and smoke forward at a high speed. In the driver's seat, Caroline sat face to face in Luo An's arms, with her arms tightly around Luo An's chest. Looking at the flames burning close to the back seat of the car, she said nothing, asked nothing, and her face did not change. She just put her head tightly on Luo An's shoulder. Caroline now had only one thought: it doesn't matter what happens, I'm tired. The black Audi pulling flames and smoke turned into another street again, and saw a port not far away, which was extremely magnificent under the lights, and many yachts shuttled through it. Roan glanced at the pursuit vehicle that he had left behind in the rear-view mirror. His face turned grim, and he said to Caroline again, "Hold on to me. Hold your breath." After that, Roan stepped on the accelerator to the bottom. After the car engine roared and rushed out of the street guardrail and flew directly to the ocean in the port, he suddenly opened the car door and jumped out of the driver's seat holding Caroline. In the stunned eyes of a group of yacht guests, a car burning with flames broke through the guardrail, flew straight out of the road not far away, and plunged into the sea. Boom. Jesus. Oh my god. Help. The moment the car crashed into the sea, a group of people on the yacht screamed in surprise. Some took up the camera to take pictures, and some called the police. The staff who had been patrolling the area immediately started the yacht and drove towards the place where the car fell into the water. At the same time, 3 cars on the street not far away stopped by the roadside with a harsh brake sound. Several people got out of the car quickly and ran to the damaged railing to look down. When they saw several yachts circling around a bubbling position, their faces all became extremely ugly. Several people from different organizations looked at each other, then snorted coldly, turned back to their cars, reported the situation, and drove the car away from here to the port to find out the details of the car. Just as people from all parties went to the place where the car fell into the sea and tried to send people to salvage and check the situation, on the other side of the port, a yacht docked at the edge, with a dark position on the side without lights. A man and a woman slowly floated up from the sea. Caroline had no strength at this time, and her whole body was trembling because of the cold sea water. Luo An picked her up from the sea and carried her into the interior room of the yacht that had been prepared in advance. After handing the towel and new clothes to Caroline, Roan turned and left the room. Standing in the living room, he changed his clothes and called Mona. "What step has your side reached now?" "It's almost the last step. The CIA's enhanced version of truth serum is quite effective. Bernikov said a lot of things." In the basement of a room, Mona looked up at Bernikov Robert, who was sitting on a chair not far away and had fainted. Then she lowered her head and asked while typing on the computer, "What's the situation on your side? How is Caroline?" Roan had been holding Caroline's hand throughout the operation today. He had no choice, because Mona was the only one among the 3 who was good at computers, interrogation, investigation, and counter-investigation. Therefore, the task of driving Bernikov away first had to be given to her. Roan drove Caroline in the opposite direction to cover Mona. As for why Caroline was not replaced with a dummy, on the one hand, time was tight and there was no time to make 2, and on the other hand, the pursuers had to see Caroline running alive, so that they would believe that Roan's was the real one. The chance of being discovered holding 2 dummies is much greater than the chance of being discovered holding 1 dummy. Roan took off the gloves on his fingers that were used to cover fingerprints, but they were swollen by the seawater. He was about to answer the question when Mona on the other end of the phone suddenly exclaimed, "Roan, my father is still alive. I found where he is being held." Chapter 433, Clues, 36 Stratagems, Harvest, Conspiracy. Inside the yacht, Roan took off his wet clothes and put them into a backpack, ready to take them away with Caroline's wet clothes to be destroyed. Hearing Mona say that Javeri was still alive, Roan put on new clothes and asked, "Where is he?" "In an underground bunker in Albania." Mona on the other end of the phone tapped the keyboard a few times and replied, "It is a transit station for the human trafficking criminal organization under Bernikov." Roan nodded in understanding. "Okay, I'll go back later." After hanging up the phone, Roan thought about the situation in Albania. Because of an unreliable leader, this small country's land was full of bunkers, and it also asked for nearly 1 million guns, more than 1 billion rounds of bullets, and a lot of tanks and planes from other countries. Not long after, Albania's national finances and people went bankrupt because of the Ponzi scheme, so various gangs and criminal organizations rose rapidly in a short period of time, and human trafficking directly became a basic business. Thinking of this, Roan had a slight headache. The good news is that they don't have to worry about weapons and ammunition when they go to Albania this time, because weapons are the least valuable thing there. AK bullets can be bought for 2 cents each. The bad news is that the guards who are responsible for detaining Javeri are not short of weapons. Considering that ordinary people there can drive tanks to buy things, the guards probably don't lack tanks either. After thinking for a few seconds, Roan slowly came up with plans A to Z in his mind. After changing his clothes, he walked to the room deep in the yacht and knocked on the door. "Caroline, how are you?" "I'm done packing." The door opened quickly. Caroline's face was still a little pale. She stuffed her wet clothes into the backpack in Roan's hand and then took a car with Roan to leave the area. On the way, Roan told Caroline that Mona had found Javeri. Caroline's face was immediately full of joy. Then she thought about it, lowered her head, and counted on her fingers. Luo An was a little confused. What are you calculating? I'm calculating your plans for the past few days. Caroline said this in Chinese. She counted on her fingers and said with admiration, there is an ancient book in the East called 36 Stratagems. Starting from the Federation to Europe, you use the strategies in this book, such as concealing the truth, creating something out of nothing, making a feint to the east, and attacking in the west, sneaking through Chenkang, hiding a dagger within a smiling face, alerting the snake when it strikes the grass, capturing the thief and the king, escaping from the shell, covering one's ears, and stealing the bell, and working in cahoots with one's wolf and sheep. Stop. Hearing that the idioms Caroline said were getting more and more outrageous, Luo An interrupted her with a frown. The last few words don't seem to be from the 36 stratagems. Really? Caroline blinked and then said that Eastern culture was too complicated and it was good enough for her to understand so much and she shouldn't mind the small details. Then Caroline stared at Ron with big eyes, and the language switched back to English, and asked with a smile, what are you going to do to rescue my father next? Will you still use the words in the book? Maybe. Ron was still not sure. A few minutes later, he drove the car out of Monaco and entered France. As a wealthy man who cares about his own safety, Mr. Bernakov Robert spent a lot of money to implant a positioning chip in his arm. Unfortunately, Ron thought of this possibility. Although he was not 100% sure, based on the principle of caution, and just in case, Ron still asked Mona to make a shielding device. When Bernakov was stuffed into the car, Mona tied the shielding device directly to his stomach according to Ron's plan. When the effect of the sleeping potion wore off, Bernakov woke up and found that he was tied to a chair. He was not very panicked. He even smiled slightly, showing his calm temperament. But when he looked down and found something tied to his stomach and a masked woman was holding a needle and stabbing him, Bernakov's face changed and he finally couldn't hold it back and started cursing. Ron and Caroline arrived at the basement and saw Bernakov hanging his head and mumbling in a low voice, even drooling. They were both stunned for a moment. Caroline frowned and looked at Mona. Did you make him demented? I shouldn't have. Bernakov's physique is not good, and I didn't mean it. Mona spread her hands helplessly, saying that the dose of truth serum she injected into Bernakov was the same as Ron had given to the two guys guarding the piano store before. But Bernakov was a little older, and his body was hollowed out by alcohol and sex, so he became like this. Forget it, it doesn't matter. Caroline wanted to say something else, but Ron waved his hand, walked to Mona, and looked down at the interrogation records she had sorted out. Mona asked a lot of questions, and the content was also varied. In addition to information about her father Javeri, there was also a lot of information about the human trafficking criminal organization, as well as Bernakov's own bank accounts and secret bank accounts. Somewhat surprisingly, although Bernakov was a wealthy man and had several companies on the surface, those companies were fixed assets and did not have much cash flow. His real major assets were those abducted women and children, as well as a messy black industry. But these things could not be simply converted into legal funds. Mona interrogated Bernakov for a long time before she got a secret account from Bernakov, which contained 130 million euros, which was the retirement money Bernakov prepared for himself. Lassie would be jealous to death if she knew about so much pension money. Luo An laughed and decisively asked Mona to transfer the pension money to another bank account. Caroline, who was standing next to him, saw this scene with her eyes shining. After thinking for a while, she asked, what should we do with this guy Bernakov Robert next? He took advantage of the situation and framed me. Luo An laughed and took out his pistol without any nonsense. He sent Bernakov Robert to hell to let him atone for his sins. Then Luo An patted Mona on the shoulder and said, Mona, send a message to one of the heads of this criminal organization in Greece, saying, the order has been completed. Please enter the original account number within the specified time for the subsequent payment. Happy cooperation. In addition, this message must be accidentally leaked out, and it would be best if it was discovered by MI6 or CIA. As mentioned earlier, Bernakov is only one of the three heads of the European business of this human trafficking criminal organization. The other two heads are one in the United Kingdom and one in Greece. The three persons in charge seemed to have a good relationship on the surface, but they all wanted to kick the other two out and take over the business themselves. After receiving the news, the Greek person in charge knew that someone was framing him, but he would never say that he was framed. He would only do his best to plunder and seize the business and territory left after Bernakov's death. The CIA and MI6 would doubt the truth of this matter, but they had no choice. After all, they found the clues through their own efforts, and the Greek person in charge would benefit the most afterwards, so they had to investigate him first. By then, the Greek person in charge would fight to the death with the CIA and MI6, and the European underground world would be in chaos. Everyone's attention would be attracted to them, and Roan and others could get Javarie out quietly. Clap, clap, clap. After figuring this out, Caroline looked at Roan with admiration, clapped his hands and exclaimed, "Roan, you are so awesome. This is what the East calls an open conspiracy, right?" Roan chuckled. "Don't stop. Keep praising. I love to hear it." Caroline rolled her eyes when she heard that. Mona, who was sitting next to her, asked while typing on the keyboard, "So, are we leaving for Albania soon?" "No." Roan pondered for a few seconds, shook his head slowly, took out his cell phone and said, "I need to make a call first." Mona and Caroline were both a little confused. Who to call? Mrs. Hanover. X2. Chapter 434. Rescue begins, and a third party suddenly encounters. Before the previous gambling game, Roan had always been skeptical about Mrs. Hanover's position. According to the information Mona had previously investigated, Mrs. Hanover had almost no contact with gambling. She preferred the cocktail parties and art exhibitions of the European upper class, so her trip to Monaco this time was very questionable. When Caroline and Roan entered the room and sat at the card table, Roan found that Mrs. Hanover's eyes moved slightly. It was obvious that she had noticed the two of them, but she did not make a sound. Later, when they officially played cards, Roan found that Mrs. Hanover didn't care about winning or losing at all. After a few simple rounds of probing, Roan found that she was just going to lose money to Bernakov. From this, Roan made a bold guess that Mrs. Hanover might have obtained the news that Javarie was in Bernakov's hands through her own means. Roan's plan was to win a large sum of money from Bernakov through the card game, and get the opportunity to meet Bernakov privately. Mrs. Hanover didn't have this ability, so she planned to lose money to Bernakov, so that she could meet with Bernakov privately. The two sides had different paths, but the same goal. Later, when Roan and Caroline successfully kidnapped Bernakov, Mrs. Hanover's performance in the casino also confirmed this. Monitor also sent people to chase Roan and Caroline, but the people she sent were more often messing with Bernakov's men, which obviously helped Roan and Caroline escape better. "Good evening, Mr. Detective." Hearing Roan's voice, Mrs. Hanover in the distance smiled softly. "It seems that I underestimated you before." Mrs. Hanover had already learned about Roan's successful escape from the pursuit from her men, but she didn't ask in detail. She didn't care how Roan did it. She just wanted to know where Javarie was now. "Good evening, Mrs. Hanover." Roan smiled and didn't say much nonsense. He directly said that he needed her help next. Mrs. Hanover waved her hand. "Go ahead. Mr. Javarie is currently being held in Albania, and there are many guards there." Roan told her the address of a bunker, saying that the enemy there was outnumbered and had strong physical means, and that, coupled with the enemy's local advantage, it seemed a little difficult for the three of them to rescue Javarie alone. After listening to Roan's narration, Mrs. Hanover nodded in understanding, smiled slightly and nodded in agreement. "Okay, I understand what you mean." Mrs. Hanover said that she would send some of her men with more physical means to rescue Javarie there later. After that, Mrs. Hanover asked with a smile, "Detective, after Caroline's business is over, do you plan to change jobs?" Luo An raised his eyebrows slightly. What does Mrs. Hanover mean? Thinking of the scene of Luo An's poker at the table, and the fact that Luo An and Caroline successfully kidnapped Bernakov, Mrs. Hanover's eyes were full of light. She admired Luo An very much now, and wanted to pull Luo An to work under her. Luo An smiled and declined Mrs. Hanover, but this was a good thing, which meant that Luo An's previous nesting doll disguise plan was very successful. At present Mrs. Hanover has not found out Luo An's true identity. Mrs. Hanover, who was rejected, did not say much. The two sides confirmed the situation in Albania again, simply set a time, and hung up the phone. Okay. Roan threw the phone to Caroline, and stretched his body. Mona beside him also closed the laptop, and looked up and said, "The message has been sent to the Greek person in charge, and it was also accidentally known by Me6. Me6 knew, which meant that the CIA would know it soon." Roan nodded with satisfaction after hearing this. After a simple treatment of Bernakov's body, Roan erased the traces of the three people's existence, and finally drove away from the area to the hospital. The next day, Roan and the other two took a boat across the Mediterranean to Albania. The language of Albania is Albanian, an independent language with a spelling similar to Latin. Roan and Mona could neither read nor understand it. Fortunately, there was Caroline, an expert who was proficient in most European languages, in the three-person team. After successfully finding a place to live, with the help of money and the landlord, the three of them soon got a few pistols, a few rifles, a few grenades and a pile of ammunition. The pistol and rifle looked a bit old, but they were practical and cheap. After a simple treatment, the three rented a car and went to the area where Javari was imprisoned. Javari was imprisoned in the Korka district of Albania. To the right of the Korka district, the two countries of Macedonia and Greece are located above and below. Because it is close to the border of the two countries, this area is one of the important transit points for human trafficking organizations. After arriving in this area, Luo An called Mrs. Hanover again and soon contacted the people sent by Mrs. Hanover. There were 13 people on the other side. They were a mercenary group privately funded by Mrs. Hanover's family. The leader was a Czech, a strong man named Wojciech. "Hello." Seeing Luo An and the other two, Wojciech first stretched out his hand and shook hands with Caroline, then Luo An, and finally Mona. It was not that Wojciech looked down on Luo An, but the information he received showed that Caroline was the leader of the three, and Luo An and Mona were Caroline's men. Roan didn't care. Caroline didn't know much about fighting. After a few simple words, she stepped back and said that she would listen to Roan for the next action. Wojciech frowned when he heard this and turned his eyes to Roan. "Hello, Mr. Wojciech." Roan laughed and knew what the other party was worried about, so he directly made it clear that he would listen to the other party's command during the operation and would never compete with Wojciech for leadership. Hearing this, Wojciech's mouth suddenly grinned. Wojciech, who had been in the battlefield for many years, was most afraid of not how terrible the enemy was, but the teammates who dragged him down. Before Roan and the other two arrived here, the vigorous and resolute Wojciech had sent several mercenary team members to go out and investigate the situation and information of the bunker where Javari was imprisoned. We didn't find out which room the target person was in. After the team members came back, they reported, but we found that the bunker has 4 floors, 1 above ground and 3 underground. Judging from the food needed for the bunker every day, there are about 300 people in it. Among these foods, there are only 50 high-calorie foods, and the rest of the food can only maintain the basic needs of human survival. So the remaining 250 people should be trafficked women and children and prisoners similar to the target person. Okay. After learning the number of enemies in the anchor, Wojciech nodded with satisfaction. After carefully checking the equipment and ammunition on his body, Mona and Caroline stayed outside, and Roan was assigned to him. Finally, Wojciech waved his hand. "Start the action. Quick battle and quick decision. Understood." As a mercenary group that has been wandering on the line of life and death on the battlefield for many years, this raid on the human trafficking organization and the rescue of Javari was easy for Wojciech and others. So their plan was simple: raid and break in, raid quickly, get straight to the point, and quickly retreat after rescuing the target person, and carry out a lightning operation. The plan was simple to make, and was executed smoothly. The traffickers in the bunker were no match for these mercenaries who had been fighting for years. They were beaten back step by step without any reaction, and had no power to fight back. Just as Wojciech led Roan and others deep into the second underground floor of the bunker, the communicator hanging on Wojciech's chest suddenly heard the loud shouts of the mercenary group who stayed on the first floor of the bunker to guard the situation. "You son of a bitch. Boss, a third party has entered." Bang bang bang. As soon as the voice fell, the communicator suddenly rang with the sound of more intense exchange of fire than before. Chapter 435. Finding Jolie, the ideas and plans of various forces. Bang, 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 bang. The sound of the gunfire this time was much more intense than the previous gunfire between the Wojciech mercenaries and the human traffickers. Two of the mercenaries who stayed on the first floor died soon, and the remaining one quickly fled to the underground floor of the bunker. Fouquet. When Wojciech heard the news, his face suddenly became very ugly, and he quickly ordered the rest of the team members to retreat underground. Roan's face also changed. He thought of Mona and Caroline outside. He took out his mobile phone and found that he could not contact them. He frowned slightly, wondering what they were doing now. Alois. The situation was urgent now. Wojciech looked at Roan calmly, stretched out his hand, and pulled a team member, indicating that he should follow Roan to the underground third floor of the bunker. The underground first floor of the bunker was the residence of the group of human traffickers, and the storage room for weapons, ammunition, food, etc. A large number of kidnapped women and children were imprisoned in the underground second floor, and Jolie was not found among them. Seeing the look from the boss Wojciech, Alois pursed his lips and nodded, and continued to walk down with Roan, along with two teammates. Roan's eyes flashed with a gleam, and he also understood Wojciech's look. The other party suspected that the group of people outside were brought by Roan, so he asked Alois to kill Roan first, if he found something wrong. If it was Roan, he would make the same choice, so Roan didn't feel angry, just pretending that he didn't see anything, but silently became alert. Wojciech suspected that Roan had a problem, and Roan also suspected that Wojciech's men had a problem. The group of people outside might have been brought by Wojciech's men. Entering the third underground floor of the bunker, there was no guard. The first feeling of several people when they walked in here was only two words: damp and smelly. Even Alois's three mercenaries, who were used to seeing corpses on the battlefield, frowned and covered their noses. Roan was also dazed by the complex stench that was difficult to describe in words, but now time was running out, so he hurried forward and checked every room. Soon, Roan found Jory Evans in the fifth small room on the left. Jory's hair and beard were long and messy, his eyes were sunken and his face was dry. He was much thinner than the image in the photo provided by Caroline before. If Roan hadn't seen that he was missing his left hand, he really didn't recognize him for a moment. Hearing Roan calling his name, Jory turned his head from the bed with difficulty and asked in a hoarse voice, "Who are you?" "I'm an ordinary private detective, with Alois and other mercenaries here, and for other considerations." Roan did not reveal his true identity, but only said that he was commissioned by Caroline to come here to save Jory. After saying that, Roan shot and broke the lock on the door regardless of Jolie's reaction. Seeing that Jolie had difficulty getting up because of hunger for a long time, Roan directly carried him on his shoulders and turned around to walk out quickly. Alois and the other two mercenaries looked at each other and found nothing wrong. They hurriedly followed Roan and fled from the third underground floor. A group of women and children were imprisoned in the room on the second underground floor. Roan broke the door lock of the room where they were imprisoned on the way, but the gunshots upstairs continued, and these women and children had no intention of coming out. On the first underground floor, gunshots, shouts and scolding echoed continuously. When Roan carried Jolie here, one just exploded not far away. Bang, bang, bang. A burst of gunfire rang out, and Wojciech's mercenary group lost another person. %hash. Wojciech saw this scene. His face was very ugly, and he cursed a lot of other languages that Roan couldn't understand. Smelling a stimulating smell, Wojciech subconsciously turned his head and found that it was Roan who was carrying Jory. He glanced at Alois behind Roan and asked in a serious tone, "Is this the target person?" "Yes." Because Roan's running was a bit intense, Jory had fainted. Roan was a little speechless. He put him on the ground, pulled over a corpse, took off the bulletproof vest on the corpse, and put it on Jory. Then took out a pistol and moved behind Wojciech and asked, "Do you know who the other party is?" "They are also mercenaries." Wojciech immediately cursed when he heard this. Roan learned from his swear words that the group of people on the opposite side was a mercenary group called Desert Storm. In the past, They had had a small conflict with Wojciech's mercenary group. I don't know whose order the other party accepted this time to attack them here. Using the word desert lion as the name of the mercenary group seems a bit low, but Roan's attention was not on this. He suddenly remembered the two different documents he found before. The computer found in the safe house once contained a specific action plan and instructions for the next action. In the action plan, the name of the mercenary group Desert Lion appeared. At that time, Roan simply glanced at it and put it behind his mind. Now, combining the mercenaries outside with the document and adding Jory's disappearance and imprisonment, Roan's brain turned quickly and finally figured out the general course of events. There was a mole in the CIA where Jory Evans worked. The mole gave Jory a document that was 9 true and 1 false, causing Jory's mission to fail. The real goal of the mole was to kill Jory in this operation. But according to Mona's interrogation, Bernakov wanted to ask Jory something, and at the same time, planned to give Jory as a gift to one of his partners, so he did not kill Jory, but just imprisoned him. The mole was very angry when he knew about this, but he had no choice but to send people to find out where Jory was imprisoned and find a way to kill him to silence him. On the other hand, the insider forged a mission document and placed it in the basement room to check if anyone was ready to rescue Jory. The insider planned to lure the rescuer into a trap and let the Desert Lion mercenaries and other people kill the rescuer without anyone noticing. This insider is most likely not in the same group as the CIA member Perna in the card game. Mona checked before that the other party and Jory are not in the same team. Perna's real goal is simply to capture Bernakov and find out where Jory is. She is most likely a member of the CIA who chooses to rescue Jory. A CIA insider who wanted to kill Jory, a CIA rescuer represented by Perna, and Me6 who wanted to catch Bernakov and find out where the traitorous agent was, a Hanoverian who wanted to save people, and their own trio who also wanted to save people. Thinking about the forces and ideas of all parties, Roan's mouth suddenly opened. The operation to rescue Jory Evans was definitely the most powerful thing he encountered since he came to this world. Moreover, none of the people in these forces were simple. If Roan had not acted quickly and directly, who knows how this matter would have developed. Boom. The sudden explosion of a grenade attracted Roan's attention back. The mercenary group on the opposite side lost their patience and began to throw grenades frantically to the underground floor, obviously intending to blow down the stairs and bury Roan and Wojciech and others completely. Roan, who couldn't get through to Mona and Caroline, looked stern. The matter of the insider would be discussed later. The most important thing at the moment was to kill his way out of here. Find Mona and Caroline. Chapter 436. A single shot annihilates the mercenary group. Fouquet. Shit. *%. Seeing that the other party was going to bury the people, the 5 remaining mercenaries on the first floor of the basement, as well as Wojciech, all changed their faces. Wojciech didn't care too much and waved his hand, asking the team members to tear off the bulletproof vests on the bodies on the ground, and then rushed up with the bulletproof vests held high. Hey, you. Wojciech looked back at Roan, and just as he was about to speak, he suddenly found that Roan was lowering his head to organize the grenades and tied up the remaining bullets, weapons, and grenades on the bodies. Wojciech was stunned for a moment. What are you going to do? Blow up the building? Roan grinned, revealing a smile that made Wojciech's pupils tremble. The current situation is very clear. The Desert Lion mercenaries upstairs are going to blow up the stairs and bury Roan and others underground forever with cement bricks and other ruins. Once the other party succeeds, they will inevitably face the problem of lack of water, food, and oxygen when buried underground. There are some inhuman ways to survive the lack of water and food, which can keep them going for a while. But once they lack oxygen, they can only wait for death. Bulletproof vests can only resist some of the damage caused by bullets. Facing the grenade attack from the upper floor, it is completely useless. Wojciech's order just now was actually to let the team members take the bullet for him. Wojciech used the lives of his team members to fight for his own survival. Instead of gambling on whether the opponent's bullets and grenades are enough, Roan would rather choose to surprise the enemy, use a bomb to blow a hole on the top of his head, and then climb up from this hole to attack the enemy upstairs. This method also has risks, but it is much less risky than Wojciech's plan, so Roan quickly ran into a room deep in the basement, put the prepared bundled bomb close to the ceiling, then ran out of the room, raised the pistol from a distance, aimed at it, and pulled the trigger. Bang. Boom. The next second after the gunshot, a deafening explosion suddenly sounded, and a pile of dust instantly fell on the heads of Wojciech's team members. The dust soon cleared, and a hole with a diameter of nearly 2 meters appeared in their eyes. Seeing this, Wojciech said with great joy, "Get your weapons. Let's go upstairs from here and fight back." Understood. The mercenaries, who also showed joy on their faces, immediately responded loudly, and then climbed up from the hole one by one with their weapons. This bunker is not small, and there are many rooms on each floor. Roan blew up the floor of a room deep in the first floor. The people of the Desert Lion mercenary team only heard a loud noise from a room not far away, but they didn't guess that Roan would blow up the ceiling himself, so they were caught off guard. Roan carried the still unconscious Jawahari to the first floor, threw Jawahari into a pile of boxes to cover him, drank a bottle of hemostatic potion, a bottle of physical potion, and a bottle of swift potion, threw a grenade to clear the way, and then he took the AK rifle he picked up, and rushed out closely behind Wojciech and others. Bang, bang, bang. Luo An switched the AK to single shot mode, and moved around the rooms like a ghost. In front of the shocked eyes of Wojciech and the Desert Lion mercenaries, he shot one by one, and shot in the head every time, like a death god holding an AK. Every time a gunshot fell, a mercenary died under his gun. Fouquet. Where did this monster come from? Focus on this guy. There were a total of 22 Desert Lion mercenaries on this trip. In the blink of an eye, Luo An killed 8 of them with an AK. In addition, Wojciech and others killed 6. The leader of the Desert Lion mercenaries was extremely angry, and felt cold in his heart. He took out a grenade, and threw it at Luo An's position, and loudly ordered everyone to shoot at Luo An. Boom. Bang bang bang. The grenade exploded, and a lot of bullets flew madly towards Luo An's position. Luo An saw this, and quickly turned over, and hid behind a bunker. While dodging the bullets, he also changed a new magazine for the AK. A few seconds later, the fierce gunfire stopped temporarily. Luo An was about to get up and continue the attack when he suddenly found that the remaining people of the Desert Lion mercenary group began to retreat outside the bunker. Not good. Get out of here. Without waiting for Luo An to speak, Wojciech, who was not far away, suddenly changed his face. He quickly got up and ran madly to the window on the other side of the bunker, shouting as he ran, "This is the combat habit of the Desert Lion mercenary group. They plan to use a PG to clean up the ground." Fouquet. Luo An's face also changed when he heard this. He didn't intend to use his body to fight RPG head on, so he quickly found the unconscious Jolly and carried him to run out of the bunker from the other side. Whoosh, boom, boom, boom. Several pointed and fat-bellied bullets drew arcs and broke into the bunker. The next second, the earth-shaking explosion suddenly exploded, and the entire bunker collapsed into ruins in an instant. Luo An and others fell heavily on the ground, almost buried in the ruins. What a bunch of beasts. Thinking of the women and children who dared not move because of fear under the bunker, Luo An frowned and cursed several times. Without hesitation, he immediately picked up the AK rifle, and while the dust from the explosion had not yet dissipated, he stomped his right foot on the ground and rushed towards the location of the group of desert lions like a cheetah. Check the scene carefully. Looking at the bunker that was razed to the ground, the captain of the Desert Lion mercenary group looked at the number of people who had been reduced by half, snorted coldly, and ordered loudly, "Make sure those people are dead." Understood. The remaining 7 members of the Desert Lion mercenary group nodded loudly. Bang, bang. Putting the RPG aside, the 7 people picked up their rifles and prepared to go to check the situation. Suddenly, 2 gunshots were heard from the side, and then 2 people were shot in the head and fell to the ground. There is an enemy on the side. I see him. Seeing their teammates fall to the ground, the reactions of several people were extremely fast. They raised their guns and aimed at the direction of Luo An and pulled the trigger without hesitation. But Luo An was very fast and his marksmanship was extremely sharp. He moved around like a ghost between several bunkers and kept shooting. At the cost of 2 shots in his left arm and calf, He shot the head with a single AK, not only killing the remaining 5 team members, but also hitting the right hand of the Desert Lion mercenary team leader who was holding the gun. Holding the AK rifle, Luo An had a cold face, stepped over the bodies with shocked and surprised faces, and walked slowly to the front of the Desert Lion mercenary team leader. The Desert Lion mercenary team leader's eyes were full of shock. He swallowed slowly, and did not choose to give up. Seeing Luo An walking in front of him, he shouted and took out a dagger from his pocket with his left hand, and stabbed Luo An fiercely. Bang! Luo An slightly dodged to the left to avoid the dagger, raised his right leg, and kicked him hard, then snatched the dagger, and stabbed it directly into the left hand of the Desert Lion mercenary team leader, nailing his left hand firmly to the ground. Ah! Bang! The captain of the Desert Lion mercenary team screamed, and Luo An punched him in the face, then bent down, exuding an indescribable chill, staring at the other party's eyes, and asked in a cold voice, "Where are the 2 women? Who sent you?" Hearing this, the captain of the Desert Lion mercenary team suddenly grinned and said ferociously, "If you let me go, I will tell you. Then you can die." Luo An stared at the other party's eyes for a few seconds, suddenly grinned, and did not continue to talk nonsense. He stood up and kicked the captain of the Desert Lion mercenary team in the stomach, then picked up a grenade from the corpse beside him, stuffed it into the mouth of the captain of the Desert Lion mercenary team, and turned away without looking back. Boom. Seeing the captain of the Desert Lion mercenary team blown into pieces of meat by a flash of fire behind Luo An, and the corpses with heads shot all over the ground in front of Luo An, Wojcik took a breath of cold air, looking at Luo An with extremely shocked eyes, and his face was full of disbelief. Seeing Luo An walking around him with his AK, and heading straight into the distance, Wojcik swallowed his saliva and asked dryly, "Where are you going?" Click. Luo An replaced the magazine for the AK in his hand, drank a bottle of painkillers, where Wojcik couldn't see, and replied coldly without looking back, "Murder." Chapter 437 Kidnapper, Alaska single shot, kill the driver first. Albania, Korka district, in a building 2 kilometers southwest of a bunker. A mercenary named Bert, who was missing 2 fingers on his right hand, was holding a communication device and shouting loudly, "Boss, are you there? What's going on over there?" After he finished speaking, there was no response from the other end of the communication device. Bert swallowed his saliva and was silent for a second. He called the communicators of other people in the team. Still no one answered. Fouquet. Bert's face suddenly turned as black as the bottom of a pot when he saw this. He put away the communicator, walked out of the room quickly, and said to the 3 mercenary team members in the corridor outside, "Everyone, I'm afraid the mission on the boss side has failed. Let's evacuate as soon as possible." What? What did you say? Several mercenary team members looked at each other in disbelief. Is there another organization entering the field? The mercenaries in the Desert Lion team knew their boss and equipment very well. They had also read the enemy's information before setting off on this mission. In addition, this was a sneak attack, so they didn't think the mission would fail at all. Now the boss and his teammates are all out of contact. The only reasonable explanation they can think of is that after the one they attacked, someone else attacked them. I don't know the specific situation. Let's evacuate first and talk about the rest later. As a mercenary, running away immediately when you find something wrong is a basic skill. Bert didn't think of staying here and waiting for the enemy to come or rushing out to avenge the boss. He is not one of those brainless guys. Okay. Several mercenaries nodded repeatedly. One of them pushed open the door behind him, pointed to the situation in the room, and asked, "What should we do with them?" In the room, it was Mona and Caroline who were tied together with tape on their mouths. Next to them were the bodies of 2 members of the Wojcik mercenary team. Not long after Owen and Wojcik entered the bunker, the Desert Lion mercenary group attacked this area. The incident happened suddenly, and the other side was outnumbered. The few people left outside the bunker had no time to react, and were surrounded by the Desert Lion mercenary group. 2 of Wojcik's team members were shot in the head and killed. Because the captain of the Desert Lion mercenary received a call, Mona and Caroline were left behind. Take them with you. Bert waved his hand and signaled to take Mona and Caroline with him. On the one hand, he was beside the boss when he answered the phone and heard the person on the other end of the phone asking them to stay. On the other hand, he also wanted to take Mona and Caroline with him, so that they could be used as hostages or to block gunfire at critical moments. Understood. Upon hearing this, several mercenaries immediately walked into the room, untied the ropes on Mona and Caroline's legs, pointed guns at their heads, and said sternly, "Get up. Get in the car with us." Mona was an FBI after all, and had taken similar courses at the FBI training academy before, so she was not very panicked. With her mouth sealed and unable to speak, Mona glared at the mercenary next to her, then stood up and protected Caroline and walked out. Caroline's eyes were red and her body was shaking. She was the most scared one, because she had never learned what to do when she was kidnapped in her first half of her life. Several people on the other side pointed guns at her, and their eyes were not very clear. Caroline, who was well read and knowledgeable, instantly remembered a lot of messed up stories and tragedies in her mind. If Mona hadn't been comforting her by pinching each other's fingers and sending messages through Morse code, Caroline felt that she might not be able to hold on. The two were pushed into the backseat of a large SUV. Looking at the two mercenaries sitting next to them and guarding them with guns, Caroline, whose hands were tied at the back, grabbed Mona's hands, which were also tied at the back, and began to pinch Mona's fingers frantically, asking in Morse code, "What should we do? Where are they taking us? How is Roan? Will Roan come to save us?" Seeing the SUV start to drive away, Mona was also very anxious, but she still suppressed the negative emotions in her heart and slowly pinched her fingers to respond to Caroline. "Believe in Roan. Believe in him." Caroline's face was pale. She didn't believe in religion before, but occasionally went to church with some friends to participate in worship out of politeness. But now Caroline hoped that God was real, and she began to pray to God frantically in her heart. At the same time, on the top of a house just south of the SUV's route, Roan was holding an AK rifle and aiming seriously. After killing the leader of the Desert Lion mercenary team, Roan immediately drank a bottle of painkiller and ran to the location where Mona, Caroline and others had stayed. During this period, because the bullet was in his body, he did not feel any pain, but felt a foreign body, which made him unable to run fast. So Roan took out a dagger and dug out the bullets in his left arm and left calf. The hemostatic potion he had drunk before took effect quickly. The wound did not heal but stopped bleeding. After Roan ran to the location where he stayed, he quickly found them, based on the clues left by Mona and the traces left by the Desert Lion mercenaries. Finding that the other party was about to drive away, Roan quickly picked up the AK and took a shortcut to the side of the SUV's route, ready to stop it with a gun. "Ladies, relax a little, we won't do anything to you now, because someone wants to see you." Seeing the unstoppable fear in Caroline's eyes, Bert, who was sitting in the co-pilot, laughed, turned around, and looked up and down at the two of them. Mona glared at Bert, while Caroline whimpered to show that she wanted to speak. Bert reached out and tore off the tape on Caroline's mouth. Caroline swallowed and asked, "Are you sure you won't hurt us?" "Of course, we won't go against money." Bert spread his hands, and before Caroline could breathe a sigh of relief, Bert suddenly grinned and said, "But if the people behind you say you are useless, the situation may not be certain." Caroline's heart, which had just been slightly relieved, was lifted up again, and she looked terrified. Bert and several mercenaries looked up and laughed. Bang! At this moment, a gunshot suddenly rang out. The next second, a hole appeared in the windshield of the SUV. The grinning driver was shot in the forehead, and his head sank and hit the steering wheel. Fouquet. Everyone in the SUV was shocked. Bert, who was sitting in the passenger seat, quickly pushed the dead driver away to control the steering wheel. Not far ahead was a house owned by a passerby. Bert was a step too slow. The SUV smashed through the wall of the house and broke into the room, being covered by the collapsed house. Seeing this, Roan sneered, grabbed the wall in front of him, turned over and jumped off the roof. "Shit. Damn it." Bert and the other two mercenaries in the SUV quickly climbed out of the dust, muttered a few words, and the three of them quickly reached out to grab Mona and Caroline. Seeing that the two women refused to get out of the car, they immediately raised their guns and shouted, "Get down quickly, otherwise I will." Bang, bang. Before the mercenary could finish his words, two gunshots suddenly rang out, and the two were suddenly shattered in the head by bullets flying from a distance. *## Bert's pupils shrank when he saw this scene, and he quickly ran to the other side of the SUV to avoid the bullets. At the same time, he opened the door on the other side, pulled the screaming Caroline out of the car, blocked her in front of him, and shouted towards the smoke in the distance, "Come out! Come out! Throw away your weapons. Otherwise I will shoot." Chapter 438. Jawless face stiffened when he learned of Luo An's identity. Until now, when all his teammates were dead and he was the only one left, Bert always believed that the reason for the destruction of his boss was that another organization appeared and launched a sneak attack, and the teammates in the off-road vehicle were also killed by this organization. So when the dust cleared and he saw only Roan holding an AK rifle, Bert couldn't help looking back and around, shouting, "Where are the others? Let them come out. There are no others." Roan slowly moved forward with the AK, grinning and showing a cold smile. "I'll give you a chance. Put down your weapon." Impossible. Bert still refused to believe Roan's words. He kept observing the surroundings and paying full attention to guard against possible enemies behind him or in other directions. At the same time, he held the pistol against Caroline's temple and shouted, "Don't try to lie to me. I'm saying it for the last time. Let those people come out. Otherwise I will shoot." Thinking from another perspective, Roan could understand the enemy's idea of not believing his words. However, Roan still felt a little speechless. He turned his eyes to Mona and Caroline, changed his tone, and whispered, "How are you? Are you okay? Sorry, I'm late." "We are fine." Mona, who was sitting in the car, and Caroline, who was taken hostage, saw Roan's face. Their eyes lit up, and they were extremely excited. Especially Caroline. Although she was still held hostage, her body was no longer shaking, and she now trusted Roan very much. When Mona answered the question, she gave Roan a look. She was sitting in the car at this time, very close to Bert, and she could do something to attract his attention and help Roan get rid of him. Roan, who was very familiar with Mona, understood her idea, but shook his head calmly. He had a way to deal with the other party, so there was no need for Mona to take risks. Ignoring Mona's eyes again, Roan shouted, "Hey, I can get my teammates out. Don't hurt the hostages." Bert snorted coldly, "Don't talk nonsense." "Okay." Roan pretended to put down the AK, then raised his hand to his right and waved to the half-collapsed wall on Bert's left. "Brother, come out." Bert saw this and subconsciously tilted his head slightly to look in that direction. At this moment, Roan suddenly moved to his left at a high speed, then raised the AK and pulled the trigger at Bert. Bang, bang. 2 shots were fired. One bullet hit Bert's right hand holding the gun, and the other bullet hit his right arm. Bert just screamed, and the next second, Roan moved in front of him like a cheetah and kicked Bert's waist with a whip kick. Bert was smashed to the ground like a rag doll, stirring up a cloud of dust. Roan followed closely and moved to Bert's side. Bert subconsciously took out a dagger and stabbed, but Roan easily dodged it and then snatched the dagger and threw it aside. He raised his fist and hit Bert's head hard, knocking him unconscious. Roan tore Bert's coat to pieces and tied Bert's hands and feet together tightly. Roan took out a dagger and cut the ropes on Caroline and Mona's hands. Caroline took a step ahead of Mona and gave Roan a big hug. Then, without waiting for Roan and Mona to react, Caroline quickly ran to the tied Bert and kicked him hard with her foot. Roan was speechless when he saw this. Mona came forward to hug Roan and bit him lightly on the mouth. When she found the wound on Roan's left arm, Mona's expression instantly became very nervous, and she quickly went to look for first aid medicine on the corpse. Roan laughed and let Mona deal with his left arm. When Caroline said something malicious, he told the two about the situation of their father, Javery Evans. The mission was successful. The man was just locked up for too long and lacked nutrition. Other than that, there was nothing serious. Caroline was delighted when she heard this. Mona looked up and took a deep look at Roan and then continued to treat the wound on Roan's calf. Caroline thought for a moment, pointed to Bert who was tied up not far away, and asked, "Is there any use in keeping him? He may know the identity of the traitor or the clues of the news." Roan briefly talked about the previous speculation, but he did not intend to find out who the traitor was. The father of the 2 girls, Jolly, should hate that person more than he did. Sure enough, the next day, Jolly Evans hung some saline solution. After his body recovered a little, he went directly into the room where Bert was imprisoned and interrogated him. The interrogation did not take long and ended in less than 10 minutes. Caroline was a little confused about this. Jolly laughed and said that during the time he was imprisoned, he had seriously recalled the situation of this mission dozens of times and checked and analyzed everyone who had contact with this mission. Javery has already locked on a suspect, and this interrogation of Bert was just to verify his own thoughts and guesses. The interrogation results proved that Javery's judgment was correct, and the traitor was the person he thought. Roan didn't care about who the traitor was and what Javery planned to do afterwards, and he didn't plan to ask because Javery was staring at him at this time. At first, when Javery just woke up from the hospital bed, he saw Roan with a smile on his face. Because Javery remembered that before he fell into a coma, Roan said that he was a private detective hired by Caroline. Although the other party was for money, after all, he saved his life, and Javery was still very grateful to Roan. Later, when he saw Mona who had erased her disguise, Javery was surprised. Just as he was about to say something, he learned from Caroline that Roan's real identity was not a private detective, but Mona's boyfriend. The smile on Javery's face suddenly froze, and his eyes looking at Roan instantly became wrong. "I know you, Roan Greenwood." Looking at the face in front of him, that was 3 times more handsome than when he was young without disguise. Javery slowly exhaled a breath of turbid air and said in a concentrated voice, "The youngest FBI Special Investigation Team leader, right?" While Javery was looking at Roan, Roan was also looking at him. When he just came out of the dungeon, Javery had a messy beard and messy hair, and he looked more homeless than a homeless person. Javery has now taken a shower and taken care of his hair and beard. He has become a little thin due to malnutrition, but the mature, steady, and handsome manly temperament is still overwhelming. Roan understands why Mrs. Hanover is obsessed with Javery. "Yes, Mr. Javery." Roan laughed and answered the other party's question. This is the first time in his 2 lives that he has officially talked to someone of his father-in-law's status, but the current scene is not the same as he imagined before. The two are now sitting on a cruise ship heading to France. There are only him and Javery in the room, and Mona and Caroline live next door. In the middle of the room, there was a small coffee table. Javery and Roan sat face to face. There was no tea on the coffee table, only 3 bottles of vodka and 2 wine glasses. "Mona is my favorite daughter." Javery picked up a bottle of vodka, filled the glass in front of Roan, and also filled the glass in front of himself, then picked up the glass and gestured. "You saved my life this time. I'm very grateful for this. But if you hurt her later, believe me, I will still shoot you. I won't give you this chance." Roan laughed, picked up the glass, and clinked it with Javery. Then the two raised their heads and drank it all. "You can drink well." Putting down the glass, looking at Roan with a calm face and unchanged breathing, Javery nodded with satisfaction and continued to pick up the vodka to fill the 2 glasses. The two picked up the glass again, and Javery suddenly asked, "What do you think of Caroline?" If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 439, End of the Incident, Harvest, Old Father's Distrust. Javery's words were incoherent and a little sudden. Roan was stunned for a moment and replied with a smile, "Linguist, very smart." "Really?" Javery looked at Roan deeply, and without saying much, they clinked their glasses and drank again, and then began to chat about other topics. At the same time, next to Roan and Javery's room, Mona sat on the table and fiddled with the computer, and Caroline lay on the bed, holding a pen to calculate their expenses and gains during this period. The money spent was not small, but Caroline had forgotten it, and her eyes were all on the gains. First of all, Roan had won 152 million in the casino before. Before entering the casino, they had already made a good allocation of funds. Roan, as the leader of the game, took 70%, a total of 106.4 million. Caroline took 20%, a total of 30.4 million. and Mona took 10%, a total of 15.2 million. In addition, there was also the 130 million retirement money that Bernakov prepared for himself. Roan took 50%, 65 million, and Mona and Caroline each took 25%, 32.5 million. Adding up the gains, Roan received a total of 171.4 million, Mona received 47.7 million, and Caroline received 62.9 million. Looking at the numbers in front of her, Caroline's eyes flashed with an extremely bright light, and she screamed excitedly, then hugged Mona, and kissed her hard on the face. Mona was startled by Caroline's sudden scream. Seeing that she was suddenly attacked by her, she pushed her away with disgust. Caroline, what are you crazy about? Nothing, I just want to express my gratitude to you and Luo An. Caroline smiled and put the result of her calculation in front of Mona, then put her hands on her hips and smiled. Also, I'm older than you. You have to call me sister, not just my name. Got it, Caroline. Mona saw the numbers on the notebook and a happy smile flashed in her eyes, but she didn't pay much attention to Caroline. After a casual reply, she threw the notebook back to Caroline and continued typing on the computer keyboard. HMPH. Caroline threw the notebook back on the bed and snorted. She looked at the seawater outside, suddenly came close to Mona, and asked with a low laugh, guess what the two men in the next room are talking about? I guess their topic must be you. Mona ignored Caroline, and Caroline didn't care. She continued to talk to herself. Roan likes you very much. There is no need to analyze this. But my father loves you too, and he always hopes that you can stay away from all kinds of dangers and live a safe life like an ordinary person. When he learned that you joined the FBI, he was very angry. Caroline said a lot and finally concluded, my father will probably let Roan persuade you to leave the FBI, and Roan loves you very much, so he may agree. Have you said enough? Mona closed the computer with a snap, looked back at Caroline, and said coldly, first, Roan loves me, but he also respects me. Unless I want to, he will not force me to leave the FBI. Second, Javari is my biological father, but he has participated very little in my life over the years, so he has no right to dictate my life choices. If you are bored, think about how to spend the money. After returning to Germany, invest or something. Make a plan for yourself, and don't disturb me, okay? As soon as the voice fell, without waiting for Caroline to answer, Mona opened the door with the laptop in her arms, got up and left the room. Looking at the closed door, Caroline was silent for a long time, not knowing what she was thinking, and finally lifted the quilt on the bed and got in. In the next room, 2 bottles of vodka were missing from the table, and Jorali's face and eyes had all turned red. Luo An was also a little dazed. While Jorali was not paying attention when pouring the wine, he drank 2 bottles of physical strength potion, which made him feel much better. Mona is a very contradictory girl. Javari picked up the glass again and clinked it with Luo An's. Javari said, she is very lazy in life, but very diligent in study. She is very smart on the computer, but sometimes she does some stupid things that make people speechless. But these are not the biggest problems. Do you know what Mona's biggest problem is? Without giving Luo An a chance to answer, Javari continued, she looks very strong, as if she can handle everything by herself. But Mona is very cowardly inside. She is so cowardly that when she meets Luo An, who can protect her, she will unconsciously lean on you. Do you understand what I mean? I understand. Luo An nodded. No matter what, Javari, the old father, is still afraid that he will hurt Mona. Luo An has never been a father, so he can't think from his perspective, but he can guess what Javari is thinking. No, you don't understand at all. After another glass of wine, Jorali continued to talk nonsense. Luo An sat opposite and listened quietly, without any impatience. If he had a cabbage in the future, but the cabbage brought back a pig, Luo An felt that he would probably be helpless to drink. Wait, isn't that comparing myself to a pig? Luo An's face changed, and he pushed the wine glass aside. Alcohol is really not a good thing. It messed up his thinking. Soon, Jorali lay on the ground and snored loudly. Luo An got up and carried him to the bed, then left the room to go outside to blow the sea breeze and breathe, sobering up his mind. On the deck of the cruise ship, Mona found Luo An, who was drunk. She asked for 2 glasses of lemon honey water and walked to Luo An and handed him a glass. "Thank you." Luo An took the lemon honey water and thanked him, smiled and took a sip. Mona patted Roan's back, was silent for a few seconds, and asked in a low voice, "What did you talk about with Javari?" Before Javari was rescued, Mona would call Roan and Caroline father. But after Javari was rescued, she kept calling him by his name, and Javari himself didn't care. Seeing this, Roan and Caroline didn't say anything. "We talked about the old father's worries about his daughter, and the old father's distrust of his daughter's boyfriend." Roan laughed, put the lemon honey water aside, then put his arms around Mona, and guided Mona to open her arms, to welcome the sea breeze like the Titanic. Mona turned her head, first bit Roan's ear, then moved to Roan's lips, and the two kissed quietly in the sea breeze. Half a day later, the cruise arrived in southern France. Mrs. Hanover had been waiting at the port for a long time. After getting off the ship, Javari, who was drunk, touched her cheek, then motioned Roan, Mona and Caroline to go first, and he had something to discuss with Mrs. Hanover. After giving Javari a blank look, Mona and Caroline got in the car, and Roan drove them out of the port and headed straight to the 5-star hotel that had been booked before. In the next few days, Caroline returned to Germany first, and began to organize her piano store. Roan and Mona began to travel around Europe, experiencing the unique customs and food of each country. As for the inner ghost, Javari began to contact others, to deal with it himself. After returning to Europe, the connections and relationships accumulated over the years enabled Javari to successfully find the other party, and clean up the person. One morning half a month later, Roan and Mona were lying in a hotel in Norway, discussing whether to go skiing or hot springs today. Just as the two were deciding on a game of rock paper scissors, their phone suddenly rang. They pressed the answer button and heard Jawali's voice on the other end of the line. "Good morning." Jawali on the other end of the line laughed and said, "Can you suspend your trip for a few days? I have something to discuss with Mona." Chapter 440, The Truth Behind the Incident, a 500,000 fruit plate. Europe, Austrian capital, Vienna. As Roan spent more and more time with Jawali, he found that he was becoming easier to talk to, especially when Jawali had a drinking contest with Roan before. He lost. When he looked for an opportunity to compete with Roan in shooting, he lost. When he competed with Roan in fists, he lost. And after learning about Roan's outrageous gambling skills from Mrs. Hanover and Caroline, Jawali's attitude became better and better. Now the relationship between Jawali and Roan looks more like a friendship regardless of age. When they went out to drink together, Jawali said stubbornly that he had deliberately let Roan win in the previous contests, and that when they were young, 10 Roans combined could not beat Jawali alone. Roan smiled without changing his expression, then waved to the waiter, indicating that the other party should replace all the red wine on the table with vodka. Jawali's eyes widened instantly when he saw this, and he glanced at Roan. He had also seen during this period that Roan was not only a smart and agile little fox, but also thick-skinned and narrow-minded, and a little black-bellied. Selectively ignoring the glass of vodka that Roan handed him, Jawali picked up a piece of fruit on the table and stuffed it into his mouth, eating while asking, "How have you and Mona been these days? Have you noticed anything wrong?" "No." Roan shook his head. He and Mona have been traveling in various European countries these days, experiencing local customs and enjoying food everywhere. The Spanish seafood risotto, the Belgian cream-stewed vegetables and seafood, and the restaurant built next to the volcano, which relies on the flaming magma to make volcanic barbecue, all left a deep impression on Roan and Mona. However, Jawali would definitely not ask such a question for no reason, so Roan put down the glass and asked, "What happened? Remember the insider?" Jawali swallowed the fruit in his mouth and calmly explained to Roan the whole story of the incident. Jawali is 54 years old and has been working hard for the CIA for more than 30 years. In the past few years, because of Jackal John, Chapter 115, and some other things that made him irritable, and because he was getting older, he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Mrs. Hanover, so Javari submitted a retirement application to the CIA headquarters. The CIA headquarters did not reject Javary's request, but gave him one last task, which was the burner cub matter, and promised that Javary could retire and enjoy the rest of his life after handling this task. But a guy named Ross targeted Javary because of this matter. Ross was Javary's colleague who was responsible for providing logistical assistance when he performed certain tasks in Europe. His rank in the CIA was slightly higher than Javary. Javary had worked in the CIA for so many years, and naturally, according to the tradition of the CIA, he used various methods to get himself a large sum of pension money. Ross didn't know how much the money was, but he knew Javary, and knew that the money was definitely not a small amount. So Ross made some small moves in the mission file, causing Javary's mission to fail, and through Burner Cub's hands, he got the account number and password hidden in Javary's heart. Before carrying out this mission, Javary made some backup plans. But unfortunately, those backup plans were eliminated by Ross, who was familiar with him. Just in case, Ross also made a fake file in the computer of the safe house, hoping to use a trap to get rid of Javary's backup plan that he didn't find. As for Caroline, Ross knew her existence. The reason why he didn't do anything to her and mailed the severed hand to her was also to use Caroline's hand to see if Javary had any backup plans and then wipe them out together. But Ross never expected that Caroline would find such an outrageous guy as Roan. Out of caution and stability, because he was worried about exposing himself and Mona, Roan made 3 fake identities for the 3 people from the beginning of the Federation and put on Macube to pretend to be other people. Roan also made fake gloves for the 10 fingers of the 3 people to prevent the exposure of fingerprints and drove into the deep mountains and forests, smuggled into Canada, and finally turned to Europe. With Roan's operations, Ross, who was basically in Europe, completely lost track of Caroline. It happened that the CIA sent Perner and others to investigate the reasons for the failure of Javary's mission, so Ross could only pretend to be friendly with them and temporarily turn his attention away from Caroline. Then, Roan took Caroline and Mona all the way, looking for clues, entering the casino, jumping off the building to rob people, and found clues about Javary. Ross was completely confused at the time. After reacting, he cursed and quickly contacted the Desert Lion mercenaries to track and kill Roan and others to kill Javary. As a result, Roan was like the legendary heirs, and he wiped out the group of mercenaries and successfully rescued Javary from the bunker. If there was no Roan, Ross's plan to kill Javary, get the money that Javary had accumulated over the years, and deceive the CIA headquarters would have a high probability of success, and Caroline would be secretly disposed of by Ross after a while without leaving a trace. But unfortunately, Roan gave Ross a big surprise that he didn't seem to like very much. After listening to this story, Luo An's expression did not change. He picked up the pineapple on the table and stuffed it into his mouth. He stared at Javary and asked, "You just ask Mona and I if we found anything wrong in the past few days." "What do you mean? You called Mona and me back. You don't want to tell me that Ross is not dead and escaped from you, right?" "No." Javary shook his head. He has worked in the CIA for so many years, and he is not a freeloader. Ross knows him, and he also knows Ross very well. So Javary didn't spend much effort to find Ross and send him to hell to repent. Ross didn't have many friends, never got married, and had no relatives, friends, sons, etc. If he died, he died. No one would specifically seek revenge for him. Luo An breathed a sigh of relief. He thought this story would be like the old novels in his previous life, where the villain beat the younger one and the older one appeared, and it would go back and forth for dozens of chapters. So, Roan swallowed the fruit in his mouth and asked, "Why did you call me and Mona back?" "I called people back, not you, only Mona." Javary glanced at Roan. If Mona and Roan hadn't been together all day, he would have no choice but not to call them back together. Roan paused when he heard this and didn't say much. He just took the fruit plate in front of Javary and put it in front of himself. Javary was speechless and put his fork aside, saying that Ross had got a copy of his account password from him and took his money. This time, after Javary escaped from the bunker and found Ross, he got Ross's pension money from Ross in turn. Javary asked Mona to return to Europe because he planned to give the money to Mona and Caroline. Roan narrowed his eyes when he heard this and stretched out his penniless hand in front of Javari and asked, "What about mine? What about yours?" Javari was stunned for a moment and then he realized what Roan was talking about. Slapping Roan's hand away, Javari pointed to the fruit plate in front of Roan and said, "This is your share. This fruit plate costs 500,000. Do you think this is German bread from before World War II? Chapter 441. The stimulated jolly, the harvest, the emergency. Deep in a street in Vienna, in a tavern, the young and handsome Roan and the mature uncle-like Jolly were staring at each other. When Jolly heard that Roan wanted his share, his eyes widened, and he began to breathe heavily. From the cautious wrestling at the beginning to the gradual mastery of the CIA's traditional wrestling of arms and supplies, Jolly had been in the CIA for more than 30 years and accumulated nearly $50 million US. $50 million US in 2005 was definitely a large sum, so Jolly made plans. After retirement, he would give Mona $20 million and Caroline $10 million. The remaining $20 million US would be enough for him and Mrs. Hanover to live a leisurely life. Although Mrs. Hanover was richer than him and it was not his turn to pay for a leisurely life, men always wanted to save face, and Jolly was no exception. Javari thought that after he gave Mona $20 million, she would be emboldened by the money and would show her independence in front of Roan. Once she was bullied by Roan, she would have the courage to fight back and leave Roan. But Javari never expected that he heard from Caroline that Roan won more than 150 million euros in a gambling game and generously gave her more than 30 million, and Mona also got more than 10 million. In addition, they got nearly 200 million from Bernakov. Mona got more than 40 million, and Caroline got more than 60 million. The euro was higher than the US dollar. After hearing this news, Javari was stunned for a long time. This old man in his 50s, who had fought in the battlefield for more than 30 years, was used to seeing corpses, used to being injured, and close comrades died in front of him, and he no longer had much emotional fluctuations. Suddenly, he felt his heart twitching, and a feeling and impulse that could not be described in words emerged in his mind. If Caroline hadn't supported him, Javari would have almost fainted. Ross had accumulated no more than $5 million over the years, otherwise he wouldn't have targeted Javari and attacked him. So when Javari divided the money, he directly chose to ignore Roan, who was richer than him. $3 million? Hearing this number, Roan frowned slightly, and without waiting for Javari to speak, he stretched out his right hand to Javari again. "I don't care, you must give me a share of this money." Roan, like Mona, had experienced the life of a poor man, but he still valued every penny and would never waste it. In the matter of rescuing Javari, Roan said that he had made great efforts, so he must have a share. Impossible. Javari's left hand, his left hand was cut off, so he couldn't slap the table. Javari knocked the table hard with his right hand and said with an unhappy face that his daughter had become Roan's girlfriend, so Roan definitely didn't have a share of this money. Of course, Jolly said that after all, Luo An saved his life, so he couldn't just say nothing, so he would treat Luo An tonight, and Luo An could drink as much as he wanted and eat as much as he wanted from the fruit plate. Old fox. Ha ha ha. Seeing Luo An's frustrated look, Jolly raised his head and laughed and waved his hand to ask the waiter to bring the fruit. Luo An's expression was a little speechless, but he was not angry or dissatisfied in his heart. Money was not important, but attitude was important. Of course, Luo An was not very mean, and he didn't like to postpone revenge overnight. So he shifted the topic of the next conversation to other things, while using words to relax Jolly's vigilance, and pouring wine for Jolly. 3 hours later, Luo An threw the snoring Jolly into the back seat of the car, drove the car to the door of Mrs. Hanover's villa, and handed Jolly to Mrs. Hanover's housekeeper. Seeing Mrs. Hanover looking at Jolly with a cold face, Luo An showed a worried smile at the corner of his mouth. "I'm back." Returning to the hotel room where she was staying, Mona, who had just finished taking a shower, sat in front of the mirror and wiped off her makeup and said casually, smelling the strong smell of alcohol on Luo An. Mona frowned slightly. "Did you go drinking with him again?" Luo An was not an alcoholic, and he didn't drink very often, but every time he met Javari, he would come back drunk. Mona felt that Javari had led Luo An astray. Javari, who was far away on the other side of Vienna. Yeah, I drank a little. Luo An thought about the 5 bottles of vodka on the table, laughed, took off his coat, and hung it next to him. Then walked behind Mona, stretched out his hand and slowly stroked Mona's shoulders and neck, while looking up at Mona in the mirror, and smiled. I briefly discussed the matter of the inner ghost with your father. Speaking of the inner ghost, I have something to tell you. Mona grabbed Luo An's hand, and turned back to tell Luo An about the $3 million. She didn't have the same unhappy thoughts as Jolie. Roan had put a lot of effort into the whole incident, so Mona planned to give Roan 2/3 of the money Jolie gave her. It doesn't matter. Roan, who was slightly drunk, stretched out his hand to press Mona's lips to stop her from talking, then laughed, picked Mona up by the waist, and walked directly to the shower room. Mona screamed and struggled to break free. Hey, Roan. I just finished washing. Then wash again. I just put on makeup, and I haven't finished it yet. Tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, I'll continue. The next morning, Caroline came to the hotel to find Roan. She had the same idea as Mona, and they both thought that Jolie's approach was problematic. She wanted to give Roan part of the money Jolie gave her. Roan smiled and waved his hand to refuse Caroline. After emphasizing it several times, Caroline frowned and took back the money, but said that she would treat Roan and Mona to a very famous restaurant in Vienna for lunch today. Well, let's change the time to tomorrow at noon. Luo An was about to nod his head to agree, but suddenly thought of something, so he suggested changing the time. Caroline nodded without thinking too much. After leaving the hotel for a long time, she suddenly realized something. Her face turned red, and she cursed a few words in a low voice and drove away slowly. After Caroline left, Mona was still sleeping soundly, so Luo An went into the shower room to wash and tidy up his personal hygiene, and then asked the hotel waiter to come here to deliver the meal. While waiting, Luo An opened the system page in his mind. This time, after tossing around in Europe and rescuing Mona's father Javari, the system gave Luo An an evaluation of excellent and excellent, above extremely excellent, which is rarely seen once, and the treasure chests have accumulated to 10. During this period of time, Luo An has used 4 bottles of physical strength potion, 3 bottles of swiftness potion, 3 bottles of hemostatic potion, 2 bottles of pain relief potion, 2 bottles of feather fall potion, 2 bottles of sleep potion, 2 bottles of weakness potion, and 1 bottle of sensitive potion. If you don't count, you won't know. Once you count, you will be shocked. Luo An found that this incident was definitely the one that consumed the most potions. Looking at the 10 treasure chests on the system page, Luo An rubbed his fingers and prayed to all the gods in the east and the west whose names he knew. Taking a deep breath, Luo An was about to open the treasure chest when the phone next to him suddenly rang. Luo An was a little speechless, but when he found that it was Lassie who called him, he frowned and pressed the answer button. It's me, Lassie. Lassie on the other end of the phone sounded a little anxious. She didn't waste any words and asked directly, Luo An, do you still remember the 18-year-old female killer, Lexa Rodell? Who? Luo An was stunned for several seconds before he remembered who the other party was. He suddenly said, the daughter of the rich man who ran away from home, right? Chapter 333. What happened to her? The Odell family she belongs to, including the maids, nannies, cooks and others in the family, all died overnight except Lexa Rodell. What? Chapter 442. Horror case of death in the family villa while sleeping. Vienna, in a suite of a famous hotel. Luo An sat on the sofa in the living room, holding the phone with a serious face, and asked in a deep voice, Lassie, what exactly happened? A very scary case. In a room in the Federation in the distance, Lassie swallowed her saliva and explained what happened. An hour ago, Lassie was playing games with 2 new young girls, and then suddenly received a call from Lexa Rodell. Lexa Rodell, the suspect met in the previous Hollywood shooting case, has a killer boyfriend who is much older than her. Chapter 326 to Chapter 336. At that time, because Lexa Rodell was not the murderer of the case, and had no lives on hand, and had only done some petty thefts, She was bailed out by Lexa Odell's father, 86-year-old Pranay Odell, and was taken away from the special investigation team. At that time, Luo An also complained that Pranay Odell was over 80 years old and actually had an 18-year-old daughter. Rich people really know how to maintain themselves. Lassie received a call from Lexa Odell, and her face was full of confusion. She didn't understand what the other party wanted to do with her, but after pressing the answer button, Lassie's eyes widened instantly. Since being taken back to Las Vegas, Lexa has been making all kinds of troubles and never stopped. His father, Pranay Odell, is already over 80 years old this year, and he really doesn't have that much energy to waste with Lexa. After several attempts to reason with her failed, Pranay lost his patience and directly had Lexa locked in the basement of the manor. In addition to meeting Lexa's basic living needs, the internet, TV, new clothes, etc. were all completely cut off. Lexa cursed at first and refused to eat. She was once hospitalized due to hunger and lack of water. But afterwards, Lexa did not change her old nature and continued to make trouble as she pleased. Pranay respected Lexa's choice and locked her in the basement again. 50 hours ago, Pranay Odell held a cocktail party in the manor with many guests. The reception went smoothly, with music and food throughout. The guests talked about business and relationships all night and finally drove away satisfied. However, a small number of guests, for various reasons, temporarily stayed at Piranha's manor with their female or male companions for one night. The next day, everyone in the manor died. At this point, Lassie shuddered with an ugly face and said, the next morning, some people called the people in the manor and found that no one answered. At first, they just thought that there might be a problem with the telephone line in the manor, so they contacted the patrol officers in that area to check and repair it. Because of the existence of the castle law, several patrol officers did not break into the manor directly, but rang the bell at the door of the manor, but no one answered no matter what. More than 2 hours later, several patrol officers drove into the manor at the urging of their superiors and the families of the guests. Entering the duplex villa in the manor, the patrol officers found that everyone in every room had left this world in their sleep, whether they were guests, members of the Odell family, or maids, cooks and drivers. Only Lexa Odell, who was locked in the basement, was fine, but she had been locked up all this time and had no idea what happened. After listening to Lassie's narration, Luo An began to carefully recall the situation of the Odell family. The Odell family is not very populous. The wife of 86-year-old Pranay Odell died when he was young, leaving him a son. Unfortunately, this son died in a car accident when he was young, leaving Pranay Odell a daughter-in-law. When Pranay Odell was old, he married another woman. After marriage, this new wife gave birth to a son for Pranay Odell, and many years later, she gave birth to a daughter. This daughter is Lexa Odell. Compared with the unreliable Lexa Odell, the son is very reliable. He is not only smart, but also has means to manage Pranay's company in an orderly manner. Pranay Odell was very satisfied with such a reliable heir and thought that he would have no worries in the future. But accidents always happen in life, and this son's life is not long. A few years later, when he was riding a private plane, the private plane crashed in an accident. The son, the pilot, the secretary and others died on the spot. Because of this incident, Pranay Odell aged a lot in an instant. Because his son got married, but left no offspring due to health problems, the 86-year-old Pranay Odell had to focus on his last child, Lexa Odell. Pranay Odell felt that he didn't have much time left, so he wanted to use hard means to change Lexa's temper, but he never expected that before he succeeded, he and his daughter-in-law and others left this world. So, Luo An rubbed his temples, took out his mobile phone, and asked, "What does Lexa call you? What does she want to do?" She came to our special investigation team for help. Lassie said that as the only survivor in the duplex villa, and the only remaining descendant of the Odell family, Lexa Odell was suspected of being the mastermind behind this case from any angle. The enemies and those with ulterior motives of the Odell family companies and enterprises outside also began to make various moves. In addition, the relatives and friends of the dead guests asked Lexa for an explanation, and some of them planned to take advantage of the situation to tear apart and swallow up the Odell family. Lexa Odell is now surrounded by enemies. If Lexa Oddle was really a good for nothing, then things would not be so troublesome, and the Oddle family would soon be torn apart and devoured. But Lexa Oddle is not a good for nothing. On the contrary, she is very smart and capable of execution. She is ruthless to herself, and even more ruthless to others. The previous mess was more to express her dissatisfaction with Prane Oddle's manipulation of her life. Lexa Oddle knew that only with the existence of the Oddle family could she have the capital to act recklessly. So after figuring out her current situation, Lexa did not hesitate and immediately came forward. In the astonished eyes of everyone, she stood up to stabilize the precarious situation of the Oddle family, using various means such as winning over a group and suppressing a group. Killing the chicken to scare the monkey. Lexa's means were sharp, and she temporarily suppressed the restless people in the Oddle family's companies at a very fast speed. But the most urgent task is to quickly find out the truth of this case, avenge her father, and give an explanation to the family and friends of those guests, maids, chefs, drivers, etc. Lexa didn't trust the local law enforcement agencies in Las Vegas. She couldn't be sure which of the people in the complicated relationship would not do something tricky. At this time, Lexa thought of Roan, who had arrested her, and Roan's special investigation team. The people in the special investigation team were all from outside the city, and the team leader Roan Greenwood was excellent and handsome. The team members were also talented, and could definitely find out the truth of this matter. Roan frowned when he heard this. So many people died in this case, and it was not simple at first glance. In addition, the holiday was not over yet, so he shook his head and said, "This case is still." Before he finished speaking, Lassie on the other end of the phone added, "Lexa Rodell is willing to fund the special investigation team, $10 million of special case handling funds. Lexa is willing to pay an additional $2 million in overtime, pay for each member of the special investigation team, and $3 million for the team leader's overtime pay. Tell Lexa that she knows how to solve cases, and the special investigation team will find out the truth of this case." Chapter 443 Investigation Clues. Wealthy Lexa. 2006. Roan and Mona arrived in Las Vegas by plane. Lassie, Michelle, Winslow, and Chanel also arrived at the pre-booked hotel a few hours before. When Roan took on this case, he was not thinking about himself, but more about the other people in the special investigation team. Lassie and the other four were not rich people. The $2 million overtime pay was definitely a sky-high price for them. If they did not take it, they would be blamed. Roan, as a team leader, could not kill the opportunity for his team members to make money. Of course, Roan was not a wasteful person, so he took the $3 million overtime pay from the team leader. After all, this case was across regional law enforcement. Although the FBI had the ability to enforce laws across regions, it must say hello to others when going to work in other people's territory. Roan did not hide this from the team leader Potent Burn, and said hello to him. After learning that Lexa Rodell was willing to donate $5 million to the FBI Los Angeles branch for equipment replacement, the team leader Potent Burn waved his hand and took the initiative to contact the law enforcement department in Las Vegas without waiting for Roan's request. Moreover, Potent Burn also granted the special investigation team the power to act at its discretion and repeatedly reminded Roan to call him in time when encountering problems. Roan smiled and agreed. Good morning, everyone. Walking into the hotel's pre-booked room, Lassie, Michelle, Chanel, and Winslow had been waiting for a long time. After hugging them, Roan smiled and said, "How was your vacation?" "Very good." Michelle smiled. Lassie gave Roan a you-know look. Chanel smiled and said nothing. Winslow took Roan's luggage and put it aside and replied with a smile, "The vacation was good, but it was too long, and I had nothing to do. I'm afraid my skills are not as good as before. This time I'll give you another chance to show off." Roan laughed and exchanged a few simple pleasantries. He didn't say any more nonsense and waved his hand. "Everyone, go back to your room and change clothes." Now all of them were dressed in cross-dressing. They were about to start investigating the case, so they naturally had to change into the standard suits of FBI agents. Understood. All the agents nodded in unison, men on the left and women on the right, and all turned and walked into the bedroom in the suite. A few minutes later, everyone had changed their clothes, and all 6 of them had become standard-looking people wearing suits with pistols on their waists. Luo An nodded with satisfaction, put the FBI's golden badge and ID card into his pocket, and said loudly, "Everyone, I have already told you the general information of the case, so I will not repeat it here. I will now arrange the next work content. The trace examination department of the FBI in Las Vegas has already been to the crime scene, that is, the duplex villa, for investigation. But when they learned that the case was handed over to us, it might not be so smooth. So, Winslow, Chenier, the 2 of you go to the trace examination department to get the report first, and then go to the villa where the crime was committed and carefully check the clues there to see if there is anything that has been missed. In addition, remember to bring back a copy of the identity information, home addresses, etc. of all the victims in the villa." "No problem." Chenier and Winslow raised an OK gesture to Luo An and immediately turned around and left the suite. After the 2 left, Luo An turned his attention to the remaining few people. "Lassie, Mona, the 2 of you go and get the autopsy report back. We must find out the real cause of death of those people in the villa. Only in this way can we speculate how the murderer acted. In addition, the surveillance of the villa, the roads and other places near the villa, as well as the travel records of the guests that night, the departure and return times and other information must also be clarified. These are left to you 2. It's a small matter." Lassie smiled and pulled Mona out of the suite. Lassie's low voice echoed in the corridor. "Mona, you look prettier again. What kind of cosmetics did you use? Recommend?" "Mona." Roan was too lazy to pay attention to Lassie. He turned to look at Michelle, who was left in the room, and said, "Michelle, come with me. Let's go and talk to Lexarodel, the lucky and unlucky young rich woman, to see if there are any clues." "Okay, team leader." Michelle nodded and prepared to follow Roan closely to leave the suite. "No hurry." Luo An reached out and held the other person, then took out some small threads, feathers and other things, and put them around the suite door, window, bedroom door, and even the bathroom. Facing the doubts on Michelle's face, Luo An's eyes flashed with a gleam of light, but he didn't explain much, just laughed. "It's okay to be careful, let's go." "Okay." Michelle nodded and followed Luo An to leave the area by car. The Odell family, an old wealthy family that has been operating in Las Vegas for generations. Since the Federal Great Depression in 1931, in order to survive the economic difficulties, the Nevada State Assembly passed a bill to legalize gambling. When Las Vegas began to rise, the first generation of the Odell family came here and began to climb up in this city. With the efforts of several generations, the Odell family not only owns shares in several well-known casino hotels in Las Vegas, but also has a share in the food industry, clothing industry, and even universities. In terms of transportation, the Odell family almost monopolizes a quarter of Las Vegas buses, taxis, trams, etc. When she learned that the special investigation team had arrived in Las Vegas, Lexarodel immediately sent someone to deliver 6 brand new Dodge cars and said that if they were damaged, they would not have to pay for it. It was okay, and she also prepared a few spare cars for the special investigation team. X6. When Lassie, Michelle, Chinelle, and Winslow heard this, their faces were full of confusion, as if they were hit by money. Mona, who had seen the world, was speechless. Luo An frowned slightly. Lexarodel was obviously a little confused now. On the surface, the other party tried to support it without fear, but in her heart she was extremely panicked and flustered. Otherwise she would not have been doing things like throwing money around. Luo An drove with Michelle to Las Vegas quickly and met Lexarodel in an office on the top of a building. In the office, Lexarodel was wearing a red women's suit with heavy makeup on her pretty face, her eyes flying, and her red lips like blood. She looked very sharp and did not look like a 19-year-old at all. When Luo An and Michelle arrived, Lexa was sitting behind a large desk, facing 5 trembling secretaries. With a stern face, she signed various documents and sternly ordered them to carry out the work arrangements she had just made. "Good morning, team leader Luo An." Seeing Luo An and the other person walk into the office, Lexa waved her hand and asked the 5 people, to leave the office quickly to execute the order, and then said without raising her head, "Please take a seat. I will finish processing this report soon. There is coffee on the table. Pour it yourself. Good morning, Miss Lexa." Luo An laughed, not caring that the other party's words were a bit stiff, and poured 2 cups of coffee for himself and Michelle. Luo An took a sip and smiled. "It seems that you have guessed why we are here. It's not difficult to guess, because many people have the same idea." Lexa signed her name on the last page of the document, then threw away the pen, looked up and sneered. "Everyone thinks that I was the one who committed this case and killed so many people, right?" Luo An grinned, did not answer her, put down the coffee cup, stared at Lexa, and asked, "Excuse me, Miss Lexa, what happened on the night of the crime?" Chapter 444 Diary, 26 victims, cause of death. Las Vegas, an office on the rooftop of a building. Luo An put down his coffee cup, leaned forward slightly, stared at Lexa, and asked his question. Lexa's expression remained unchanged. She raised her head and stared at Luo An's eyes without showing weakness, and said word by word, "I don't know." Lexa said that the basement, where she was locked, was located in the innermost room of the basement of the duplex villa. When she was first locked up, Lexa used the skills she learned from cheating in society in those years to open the locks and escape several times. After being caught by the security personnel, the locks were successfully updated, and the basement had several more doors. Every day, the people who brought her food with the key wanted to come in, and it took more than 10 minutes to enter one floor at a time. She had no idea what happened on the night of the incident, but she only knew that no one brought her food the next morning. If the 2 patrolmen hadn't learned about Lexa's situation and hadn't found the key after a long time to find her in the basement, Lexa felt that she might have been locked to death in the basement. After listening to Lexa's narration, Luo An did not comment, and then asked, "Did you find any problems with the meal that night?" "No." Lexa shook her head, left her seat, poured herself a cup of coffee, took a sip and said, "My father thinks that food that is too delicious will make me feel like continuing to rebel, so he changed my 3 meals a day to the most ordinary jam, bread slices and milk, occasionally a little bacon or vegetable salad. These are all delivered to the basement at once every morning, and I need to calculate every bite carefully, otherwise I will have nothing to eat at night." Michelle, who had been holding a pen to record the words next to him, his eyelids twitched when he heard this, and Luo An's mouth twitched. Lexa Odell and Pranay Odell, father and daughter, are really not ordinary people. Okay. Putting aside the mess in his mind, Luo An picked up the folder on the desk and looked at it casually, then asked, "So, has the Odell family offended anyone recently? Or who has a deep hatred with the Odell family? If Lakosha also died that night, the Odell family would be completely wiped out. This is not an ordinary hatred, and it is not something that ordinary people can do." Lakosha snorted coldly, walked to the back of the desk, opened the cabinet below, took out a metal box, and handed it to Luo An, saying, "Here are some things recorded by my father that I found after I asked someone to cut open the safes in my father's bedroom and study. In addition, there is a document I sorted out in this box, which contains a list of companies or families that have had friction with the Odell family in economic or other aspects in the past 10 years. I think they may provide some help to team leader Luo An. I hope so." Luo An took the metal box and chatted with Lakosha for a few more words. After not getting any useful clues, he left the building with Michelle. The brand new Dodge was driving slowly on the streets of Las Vegas. Michelle was sitting in the passenger seat, carefully checking the diary in the metal box. Roan yawned and asked calmly, "Did you find anything? Except for some emotional stories and dissatisfaction and abusive competitors, no useful clues were found." Michelle shook her head and said that Pranay Odell was a romantic man when he was young and knew how to have fun. He gradually calmed down after the death of his first wife. Luo An was somewhat speechless. The gossip was indeed interesting, but he was not interested in it now. Just as he was about to continue talking, Michelle suddenly frowned and said, "Wait a minute, there is something wrong with this page." "What?" "Look here, these marks. Turning the diary to a page full of words, Michelle held up the back of the page to indicate to Luo An and said solemnly, "The marks left on the back of this page do not match the previous words, and there are traces of smearing, modification and covering. According to my experience, Pranayodel should have written something, then erased it, and then wrote the current words on it." Luo An took a quick look at the diary. He was not particularly knowledgeable about this aspect, so he asked directly, "Michelle, can you figure out what the original words written by Pranayodel were?" Michelle nodded. "I'll try my best, but I need some time. When we get back to the hotel, you can use your time as you like. Professional matters should be handled by professionals." Luo An was relieved to let Michelle handle the diary. At this moment, Luo An's cell phone suddenly rang. "It's me, Lassie." Lassie on the other end of the phone said seriously, "Roan, Mona is checking the surveillance records, and no clues have been found for the time being. But we have obtained the autopsy reports of the victims. The autopsy report shows that there are 26 dead people in the re-examination villa, including 4 members of the Odell family, Purane Odell, Purane Odell's wife, and Purane Odell's 2 daughters-in-law. There are 6 temporary guests, 3 men and 3 women. The 3 men are all well-known wealthy people in Las Vegas. The 2 women are the female companions of 2 of the men. The last remaining woman is older and is a longtime friend of Purane Odell. Due to physical discomfort, she temporarily lives in the duplex villa. In addition, there are 2 drivers, 2 cooks, 9 maids, a nanny, and 2 security personnel." Luo An's expression remained unchanged and he asked, "What was the cause of their death?" "Poisoning." Lassie on the other end of the phone looked at the autopsy report in her hand and said in a deep voice, "The autopsy results show that the 2 substances, arsenic trioxide and istazolam, were found in the bodies of all 25 victims." "Istazolam? Arsenic trioxide?" Luo An was stunned for a moment, and then he remembered that the arsenic trioxide that Lassie mentioned had another name in the Far East, arsenic. As for istazolam, Lassie explained that it is mainly a sedative, hypnotic, and anti-anxiety drug, and is used clinically for short-term treatment of various types of insomnia. Luo An narrowed his eyes and said, "So, the murderer put these 2 drugs in the food of everyone in the villa that night, and then let everyone feel sleepy, and go to bed, and then lost their lives in their sleep, right? Most of the victims are like this." Lassie nodded, and then said that many of them were awakened from their sleep due to the strong toxicity and endless pain. They wanted to call for help, but for some reason they couldn't contact the outside world, and finally died of pain holding the phone. So when the trace examination department arrived at the scene, they saw several people lying next to their phones with ferocious expressions, and several people lying on the ground clutching their phones tightly when they died. As soon as Lassie finished speaking, Mona next to her stopped what she was doing, pointed at the computer and said, "The report from the trace examination department shows that the telephone line leading to the outside world in the villa was cut off inside the villa. In addition, I found that from the 3rd hour after the cocktail party ended on the night of the crime to 2:30 in the morning of the next day, the patrol officers patrolling in that area reported that the signal was lost for a short period of time. Therefore, during the time of the crime, someone in that area might have used some means to deliberately block the signal there. It seems that this was an organized and planned crime." Luo An rubbed his temples and parked the car in the hotel parking lot. He called Chinya. "Did you find anything here?" Chapter 445 Winslow's Clues, Potion Harvest, Report, and Discussion. "We found the work schedule of the service staff on the night of the crime." Chinell on the other end of the phone said without further ado that she and Winslow had found the work schedule of the service staff during the cocktail party in the maid's room of the villa. The work schedule at the beginning of the cocktail party was not important, but the list of people who stayed in the villa after the cocktail party was over. The work schedule shows that there is no maid named Anna on the list of people who should have stayed on the night of the crime. Chinya looked at the notebook in her hand and said coldly, "But there was a maid named Belinda who asked for leave because of something at home that night. Anna took over this position and stayed in the villa that night." "Anna?" Luo An's brows moved slightly when he heard this and asked, "Is this woman among the 26 victims?" "Yes." Chinia replied, the crime scene report of the trace examination department shows that Ina also died in the room where she and several other maids lived that night. But there is a problem with this woman's death. Chinia's voice had just fallen, and before Luo An could speak, Winslow's voice rang out from the other end of the phone. Team leader, after the trace examination department arrived at the crime scene, they took some photos of the death scene of each victim. There were 4 maids in the room where Ina lived. The other 3 maids all looked painful, with hideous expressions and obvious signs of struggle. But Ina didn't. Although she also looked painful, she clenched her teeth and lay straight on the bed, giving people the feeling that, more like she committed suicide by taking poison after the crime was successful, right? That's right. Luo An's expression moved slightly, and he took over Winslow's words. While his mind was working quickly, Luo An asked, did you find anything else? The villa's 3 telephone lines for external communication, 2 are commonly used and 1 is a spare. They were all cut. Winslow talked about a few clues he found, then took a deep breath, and said in a deep voice, in addition, team leader, I suspect that on the night of the crime, there were more than 26 victims, and 1 Lexa Rodell in this villa. I'm afraid there were other people, and not just 1 person. Luo An's expression froze when he heard this, and he said sternly, come back and tell me in detail after the on-site inspection. Understood. After hanging up the phone, Luo An took Michelle back to the hotel suite. There was no sign of anyone sneaking in, and Luo An breathed a sigh of relief. Waving his hand to signal Michelle to sort out the diary, Luo An sat down on the chair and began to close his eyes to ponder the clues of this case. After pondering for a long time, Luo An came up with several follow-up investigation plans for the case in his mind and decided to adapt to the actual situation later. Looking up at the time, he found that Mona, Chinia and the other 4 would not be back in a short time, so Luo An closed his eyes again and began to check the system page in his mind. The system gave Luo An an excellent evaluation for his performance some time ago and accumulated 10 treasure chests. After praying to the gods in the east and the west whose names he knew, Luo An opened the 10 treasure chests one by one. The 10 treasure chests opened 2 bottles of Featherfall Potion, 2 bottles of Pain Relief Potion, 2 bottles of Hemostatic Potion, 1 bottle of Aqualung Potion, 1 bottle of Swiftness Potion, and 2 bottles of Danger Sense Potion. At this time, Luo An's system warehouse page has Stamina Potion X6, Hemostasis Potion X4, Antidotes Potion X5, Swiftness Potion X3, Strength Potion X3, Sensitivity Potion X1, Analgesic Potion X6 Featherfall Potion X2, Sleep Potion X1, Aqualung Potion X1, which can be opened almost every day. Seeing the 2 bottles of Danger Sense Potion that he had been thinking about for a long time but never appeared, Luo An immediately grinned and took them out of the system without saying a word. After drinking the 2 bottles of Danger Sense Potion, Luo An sat on the sofa and waited for a long time with a slight smile on his face, quietly waiting for the new effects of these 2 potions. But it seems that there is no change. Luo An was full of doubts and was silent for a few seconds. He tried to open the emotional perception in his mind to chat with Michelle, and then he found that emotional perception has increased the emotional changes of others. When Michelle answered different questions, she had various emotional fluctuations. After several attempts, Luo An found that he could guess the truth of the other party's words, just like in the card game, with a success rate of nearly 90%. Not only that, Luo An then asked Michelle to throw the pen at him. He found that he could clearly sense whether Michelle really wanted to harm him, and then make corresponding judgments and reactions. This ability. After handing the pen back to Michelle, Luo An scratched his head and walked back to the living room and began to think about what this new ability could be used for in the future. Michelle held the pen in her hand, looking confused and at a loss. She was silent for a few seconds and then continued to lower her head to deal with the diary. She had a hunch that there might be important clues in this diary. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Mona, Lassie, Chinia, and Winslow all returned to the hotel suite one after another. Roan pulled over 5 whiteboards that he had bought temporarily and pasted the photos of the duplex villa, the photos of the 26 victims, and the photo of Lexa Rodell on 3 of the whiteboards. Then he looked at everyone and said, "Everyone, tell me about the clues you found. I'll go first." Lassie was the first to raise her hand, but she didn't say much, just the cause of death of the 26 victims and the autopsy report. After Lassie finished speaking, she returned to her seat. Roan looked at Mona with an unchanged expression. "I checked the surveillance. Because of her emphasis on personal privacy and her distrust of modern technology, Purana Rodell did not install surveillance inside the villa, so what happened in the villa on the night of the incident is still a mystery. However, the security personnel installed a lot of surveillance cameras outside the villa and on the walls of the designated area. After my careful observation, I found that there was a problem with the surveillance on the night of the incident." Mona showed the surveillance screen on the laptop to everyone. In the 3rd hour after the cocktail party ended, that is, after the guests had left, the surveillance screen showed a slight shake of less than 1 second. Mona pointed at the trees in one of the surveillance screens and said in a cold voice, "Since this shaking, the subsequent surveillance has been replaced, and the surveillance videos played in them are all disguised. Wow, it seems that the other party is also a computer expert." Luo An narrowed his eyes slightly, then turned to look at Chinia. Chinia stood up and distributed a dozen files to everyone, saying, "This is the identity information of the 26 victims and the basic information of their family and friends. In addition, the thicker folder at the back, the first page is the list of people at the cocktail party that night, and the next dozens of pages are the identity information of all the people who participated in the cocktail party, as well as the basic information of their family and friends." Everyone took the thick folder and looked at Chinia in surprise, not understanding how she got all this in such a short time. Chanel didn't laugh, but explained calmly, "It's simple. Las Vegas is never short of talent. Okay, thank you for your hard work." Luo An didn't ask any more questions. He knew that Chanel would not cross the line, so he turned to look at Winslow, who was sitting next to him, and asked in a serious tone, "Winslow, you said before that there were other people at the crime scene. What exactly happened? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels." Chapter 446, Situation outside the villa on the night of the incident. Clues. Living room of a hotel suite in Las Vegas. I found that the bar bed wire was broken at the fence in the southwest corner outside the duplex villa. There were also traces of cars parked on the road outside the bar bed wire. Hearing Roan's question, Winslow stood up with a serious face, handed a few photos to everyone, and explained, "Based on observation, I can be sure that 2 or 3 people sneaked into the villa area from this location. After the incident, they also dealt with their footprints and bar bed wire, but the traces cannot be completely erased." Roan looked down at the photos handed by Winslow and clearly saw the traces of someone walking there. "But why?" Lassie shook the photo in her hand and asked with a puzzled look on her face. Since the maid named Anna had already poisoned the people in the villa and committed suicide by taking poison, why did these people break into the villa? Chinia was silent for a second and expressed her speculation. Could it be that these people wanted to search the villa and take something away? Winslow added, "These people may have sneaked into the villa to confirm whether the poison Anna had taken effect, or to confirm whether Anna backed down and was afraid when the time came and did not dare to poison." Michelle next to him thought about it and also expressed his speculation. Is there a possibility that it was not the maid Anna who drugged everyone in the villa, but these guys who sneaked into the villa? The maid Anna was only responsible for delivering the poison to those people one by one. It's all possible. Luo An nodded and confirmed the speculations of several people. The key issue now is that there is no surveillance in the villa. Everyone has left this world because of poison. There are no witnesses, so the situation on the night of the incident can only be reasonably speculated. Luo An was silent for a few seconds, then turned to look at Mona and asked, "Mona, are there no clues in the surveillance video about the guys who broke into the villa? At the moment, no. Mona shook her head and typed on the keyboard, saying that the surveillance on the outer wall of the villa had been replaced on the night of the incident, and she couldn't find out who the guys who broke into the villa were. In addition, the area where the Odell family's villa was located was very large and the transportation was very convenient, but there were not many road surveillance cameras, and many roads were blind spots, so Mona couldn't find the suspect vehicle at all. But it's not all bad news. Mona suddenly stopped what she was doing, turned her laptop around, pointed at the screen and said, "I calculated the distance between the road outside the fence, the inside of the duplex villa, and the patrolman who reported the loss of signal connection on the night of the crime. It's a coincidence that the location of the duplex villa and several patrolmen can form a circle, and the road outside the fence is just the center of this circle. What a beautiful coincidence." Luo An laughed and posted the clues and photos sorted out by everyone on the whiteboard one by one, summarizing as he posted. So, on the night of the crime, 3 hours after the cocktail party ended, someone first used computer means to replace the surveillance of the villa wall. Then, a car stopped at the fence at the southwest corner of the villa, and 2 or 3 people got off, cut the wire fence, blocked the signal in this area, and made it impossible for people to connect to the outside world, and then sneaked into the villa. Inside the villa, we can't be sure who poisoned it that night and how, but the maid owner is the most suspected. Everyone was poisoned to death. The 2 or 3 guys who sneaked into the villa probably did something else. After they finished their work, they followed the location of the barbed wire, left the area, and drove away without a trace. After listening to Luo An's analysis, the special investigation team agents nodded one after another. Lassie thought about it, stood up and asked, "What should we do next?" Luo An drew a big circle on the photo of the barbed wire. "The most important thing is to find out who the 2 or 3 people who sneaked into the villa are." Lassie was about to continue talking when Luo An suddenly paused, turned back and looked at Chinia and Mona, and asked in a deep voice, "What was the name of the maid who temporarily replaced the maid owner that night? Where is she now?" "The maid's name is Belinda. She is 40 years old and has a son in middle school. Belinda is mainly responsible for the logistics area, so I suspect that Anna, who replaced her shift, is the one who poisoned." Chanel immediately described Belinda's identity. As for where Belinda was now, Chanel turned to look at Mona. Mona's 10 fingers flew quickly on the keyboard and suddenly frowned. "Everyone, since the night of the incident, Belinda asked for leave to go home. There is no new record of her travel and consumption. In addition, her son did not go to school from the next day. Both of them are now out of contact." Fouquet. Lassie's face changed and she cursed when she heard this. Luo An didn't waste any words and said directly, "Mona, you stay here and use computer means to see if you can find out the identity information of those people. Chanel, you assist Mona. But before that, you two should check the last consumption records and call records of Belinda and her son before they lost contact, and see if you can find any useful clues. Michelle, hurry up and find out the situation of the diary. Winslow, Lassie, you and I will go to Belinda's house immediately." "Understood." The agents agreed loudly and immediately stood up to perform their respective tasks. The Dodge was speeding along the road in Las Vegas. Winslow was sitting in the back seat checking his equipment, while Lassie was sitting in the passenger seat, talking on the phone with Mona. Where Belinda and her son live, there are few cameras on the road, and there is no surveillance installed in their home. I checked the records of missing persons and kidnappings in that area and found nothing special. Mona on the other end of the phone said quickly, "I checked the call records between the mother and son as Luo An asked. It shows that it was her son who called her on the night when Belinda took a temporary leave. The content of the phone conversation cannot be found, but the whole process from the son's call to Belinda taking leave and leaving the villa took less than 3 minutes. In several road surveillances with cameras, it can be seen that Belinda's attitude was anxious when she was driving. After Mona hung up the phone, Lassie tilted her head and looked at Luo An who was driving, guessing, so, someone may have kidnapped Belinda's son that night, threatened Belinda with her son, and took a temporary leave and left the villa so that Anna, who had been waiting for a long time, could take her place. Luo An did not comment, and the car soon arrived at the residence of Belinda and her son. They lived in an ordinary residential building on the edge of Las Vegas. At the door of a room on the 3rd floor, Roan, Winslow, and Lassie stood on both sides, counted down to 3, and rushed into the room together. There was no corpse in the room as imagined, nor were there any signs of kidnapping and extortion as imagined, not even a sign of struggle, only normal warm decorations and unprocessed kitchen waste. Lassie picked up a pillow and took a look, but didn't find anything wrong. She looked at Winslow and shrugged. It seems that the situation is not what I imagined. If Mona hadn't confirmed through the road surveillance that Belinda had returned to the community, and they also saw Belinda's car downstairs, Lassie would have suspected that Belinda had disappeared without returning home. Lassie, Winslow, come to me. Without waiting for Winslow to answer, Roan's voice suddenly came from the bedroom. I found something. Chapter 447. $50,000. New information known by the female classmate. This bedroom is on the left side of the whole room. It is quite messy. There are many Spider-Man posters on the wall and many superhero comics on the desk. It is not difficult to guess that this is the room of Belinda's son, Henry, a middle school student. Selectively ignoring the toilet paper next to the computer and the beautiful girl desk under the bed, Winslow and Lassie walked into the room and asked in confusion, Roan, what did you find? A bag of money. Roan found a stack of US dollars in the interlayer of the desk. Lassie reached out to take it and shook it. Roan frowned slightly and said, about 13,000 US dollars. Henry can't get so much pocket money. Winslow added, Belinda can't give him so much. Her financial situation is not good enough. So, Lassie, go and check the situation of this money. See where Henry got the money. Selling illegal drugs or something. Is it related to this case? Roan didn't care much about whether Henry, a middle school student, had violated federal laws. He just wanted to know where the mother and son were now. Lassie took the money and turned around. Roan and Winslow did not find any useful clues in the room, so they left the room, checked the surveillance, and asked the neighbors. Unfortunately, because of the advocacy of freedom and privacy, the surveillance of this building was smashed, and nothing was found in the surveillance. The neighbors on both sides of Belinda's house also had no clues. They had no idea what happened to the mother and son, and they did not hear any struggles or shouts. With the emotional perception in his mind, Roan could be sure that the neighbors were telling the truth. Just as he and Winslow, who was speechless, were about to leave, an old white lady who lived on the corner of the 1st floor suddenly said something. Belinda and her son left the building with a man that night. As Roan and Winslow continued to ask, the white old lady said that she did not see what the man looked like, but only saw that he was a white man, taller than Winslow, but thinner than Roan. Roan and Winslow left the building and drove not far when Lassie suddenly called them. You two, I found out the source of the money. Roan raised his eyebrows, and Winslow was very surprised. So soon? Of course. Lassie on the other end of the phone laughed and said, in addition to Henry's fingerprints, there is another person's fingerprint on each of the money. The other party is definitely related to the money. Who is that person? A female classmate of Henry, Jess. Good afternoon, Jess. An office in a middle school branch of a business school in Las Vegas. Winslow sat at the door of the office, drinking a cup of coffee slowly. Roan and Lassie sat on 2 chairs in the office, looking at the young girl with long red hair and a few freckles on her face across the table. Henry and his mother have been missing for 2 days. This is terrible news. Seeing Jess's panic and confusion, Lassie pushed a cup of coffee in front of her, laughed, and asked, don't be nervous. We just found out that you and Henry have a good relationship. You know something about him, right? Henry and I are indeed friends. Jess swallowed, looked at Roan, and then at Lassie, and said, but I don't know about him. You know, I'm a girl, and he won't tell me a lot of things. Roan laughed. For example, the more than 10,000 US dollars? Jess was stunned for a moment, and quickly retracted her gaze, picked up the coffee, and took a sip, shook her head and said, sorry, I don't know what you are talking about. Seeing Jess's expression and actions, Roan didn't say anything, and Lassie laughed directly. Jess, deceiving the FBI and lying to the FBI will violate federal law. Except for Henry's fingerprints on the money, every other piece of money has your fingerprints. So did you give that money to Henry? Jessie lowered her head and stammered, not knowing what to do. Lassie raised her eyebrows and patted her shoulder. "Jessie, I'll give you one last chance. Tell us the truth, otherwise we will contact your parents." "No. Don't contact my parents." Hearing this, Jessie's pupils shrank, and she raised her head and shouted. Looking at Luo An's expressionless face, her body trembled violently, and she suddenly lowered her head and cried. "Luo An." A few minutes later, Jessie's emotions gradually stabilized, and she told what she knew. Henry and Jessie's relationship was actually closer. The two of them had good grades in high school, and had already started discussing where to go to college. However, if you want to go to college in the Federation, tuition is a big problem. Jessie's family is not particularly rich, but it is enough to pay for her to go to college. On the other hand, Henry, who comes from a single-parent family, has a very average financial situation. If he wants to go to college, he can only apply for a college loan. A few days ago, Henry suddenly pulled me aside mysteriously and took out $50,000. Jessie swallowed her saliva and said that she was shocked at the time and thought Henry had done something illegal. Seeing Jess worried and scared, Henry patted his chest and said not to be nervous. This money was earned by him through legal means on the internet. There is absolutely no problem. With Henry's repeated assurances, Jess gradually put down her uneasiness, and then the two began to live a life of debauchery after school. In the city of Las Vegas, they spent all the $10,000 in the blink of an eye. The reason why Jess dared not admit this was because Henry spent more than half of the $10,000 on her, buying a lot of clothes and jewelry. Of course, Henry loved his mother very much, but he couldn't explain this money, so he secretly saved $20,000 and planned to give it to his mother with a suitable reason. After going to college, looking up and looking at Lassie, Luo An asked calmly, "What is the specific matter about the money Henry earned legally on the internet?" Henry said that someone told him online that one night, he would call his mother and lie that he was seriously ill, and asked his mother to come home. This $50,000 is a deposit. As long as his mother returns home smoothly, that person will give him another $50,000. At this point, Jess cried again. Jess knew Henry's mother's job, and she had also heard about the Odell family villa case, which was so sensational. In addition, Henry lost contact the next day, and the smart Jess immediately thought of something, but because of fear and the messy thoughts in her mind, she didn't dare to speak out, let alone call the police. She could only suppress herself, and lived in fear for the past few days. "Okay." Luo An frowned and nodded. He did not comment on the behavior and actions of the 16-year-old girl in front of him. He asked directly, "Jessie, do you know who the person Henry said he contacted online is?" "I don't know." Jessie shook her head, and then added, "But I have seen Henry chatting with the other party on the computer. In order to prevent Henry from getting too close to other girls, I know the password of Henry's chat account." "Good." Luo An nodded with satisfaction, motioned Lassie to take Jessie to log into Henry's chat account, and he took out his mobile phone and called Mona. "How is your investigation going?" "Sorry, Chanel and I haven't found any useful clues." Then Mona changed the subject, but Michelle did find some interesting new clues in that diary. Chapter 448, Piranha's Tricks. 3 suspects. Las Vegas, a hotel suite. After returning to the suite with Lassie and Winslow, Roan walked directly to Michelle and asked, "What clues did you find in that notebook?" "It's not easy to describe." Michelle scratched her head, with a complicated expression on her face, while Mona and Chenia beside her looked cold. Roan was a little confused when he saw this, and reached out to take the text that Michelle handed to him. The content of the text was a few paragraphs written and erased by Rixa's father, Pranay Odell. Because he felt that he might not have much time left, Pranay Odell decided to clear out a group of people so that his daughter Rexa could smoothly take charge of those companies and enterprises in the future. If these people were fired directly and arbitrarily, it might have an adverse impact on the company's business, people's hearts and many other situations, and a compensation would be required. So Pranay Odell found his longtime friend, one of the 3 women who temporarily lived in the villa after the cocktail party, the older one. The old woman's name was Krista, and she was a family friend of the Odell family. When she was young, she had an unclear relationship with Pranay Odell. Pranay's operation was not complicated. He asked Krista to pay high salaries to recruit those people he wanted to fire to Krista's company. After those people chose to change jobs, Pranay fired them smoothly. Some of them had signed non-compete agreements with Pranay Odell's company, so Pranay Odell was planning to have lawyers sue those who changed jobs and ask them for liquidated damages in a while. X3. After reading the content of the text, Winslow snorted coldly and said nothing. Lassie was dumbfounded. She never thought that this could be done. Luo An threw the text aside, also full of emotion, worthy of being a capitalist country. The billionaire Pranay Odell is really a leader in capitalist society. So, picking up the text that Roan had thrown aside, Lassie lowered her head and looked at it carefully. Then her face was full of strange expressions. The murderer of this case may be a group of people who were deceived by Pranay Odell and Krista. Is this a revenge case? Maybe. Roan did not comment. He handed the account and password he had obtained from the middle school student Jess to Mona and said, the person who gave Henry $50,000 and asked him to pretend to be sick on the night of the crime and trick his mother Belinda to leave the villa and go home is likely to be in the same group as the people who broke into the villa on the night of the crime. Here is Henry's chat record. Mona, try to check the other party's true identity. No problem. Mona took Henry's account and password and immediately began to tap on the keyboard with 10 fingers. At this time, the time on the clock had reached 6 o'clock in the evening. Lassie called the hotel waiter to have someone deliver the meal, and Roan and others continued to analyze the clues of this case around the whiteboard. Looking at the photos of the victims on the whiteboard, Luo An suddenly pointed at the maid Anna who was suspected of poisoning and asked, Chanel, did you find anything on this woman? Only some basic information. Chanel turned around and found a folder, opened it and read, Anna, 33 years old. Her parents are in Arizona. She is not married, has no boyfriend. Her financial situation is average, and there is nothing unusual in her consumption records and bank account records. Luo An thought for a while and then asked, what about Anna's online records? Is there anything wrong with her comments and the people she contacts? Anna in the online world is very ordinary. Chanel explained. Anna rarely expresses her opinions on the internet, and most of the time she is browsing shopping pages. In terms of online social networking, Anna has almost no experience. She seems to be more traditional and doesn't like those guys who flatter themselves on the internet. Many men who apply to add her as a friend have been rejected by Anna. However, Anna's consumption records show that in the past 6 months, every Wednesday night, after get off work, she would go to a coffee shop in Southwest Las Vegas and buy a cup of coffee to take away. But there is no surveillance near that coffee shop. The service staff in the coffee shop only know that Anna left to the left after buying things. We don't know where she went, and we can't find out. Winslow was silent for a few seconds after hearing this, frowned and said, why do I feel like this woman is hiding herself or avoiding something? I have this feeling too. After Winslow finished speaking, Lassie, who had ordered the meal, came over and nodded repeatedly. Anna looks good, has a good figure, and is not short of men chasing her, but her love life has always been blank. There is only one possibility for this situation, that there is a man who makes her avoid love life all the time. Luo An didn't speak. Chinia tilted her head with a puzzled look on her face. Why can't Anna like women? Because she is not that kind of person. Lassie put her hands on her hips, smiled and said confidently, believe me, I can see it at a glance. Anna is definitely not a lesbian. And without waiting for Luo An and others to complain, Mona, who had been busy next to him, suddenly raised her hand and said loudly, everyone, I found out who the guy who chatted with Henry online and gave him $50,000 is. Hearing this, Roan and the other 5 quickly stood up and gathered around Mona, looking down at the computer screen, which showed a white young man who looked clean. Mona pointed at the computer and introduced, Petro, 23 years old, never went to college, with an average family situation, and currently unemployed. He doesn't look like a guy who can come up with $50,000. Roan complained and asked, can you find out where he got the $50,000 from? Of course, it's very simple, and there are unexpected gains. Mona's 10 fingers flew on the keyboard, and soon she called up the photos of 2 other people next to Petro's photo. Both of them were white, but older, looking at least 30 years old. The bearded guy on the left is Daryl, and the guy with a tattoo on his neck on the right is Hubert. They are the same age, both 42 years old this year. Mona pointed to the photos of the two middle-aged white men and introduced them. Their fathers are neighbors and have a good relationship. Daryl and Hubert grew up together, went to middle school together, dropped out of school together, and joined the army together. The two left the army at different times, but they got together immediately after leaving the army. Pietro is the son of their comrade in arms. Records show that the three of them are currently living together. Pietro is an unemployed vagrant. Hubert and Daryl jointly opened a car repair shop that is about to go bankrupt. The $50,000 was transferred from an account registered by Daryl. Not only that, just as Mona finished speaking, Michelle next to her also found a clue. She looked at her computer and said loudly, 2 days before and after the villa incident, the car repair shop coincidentally closed for 2 days. And the normal consumption of the three people on weekdays also stopped during those 2 days. It's a coincidence that the closing time is right, and they also have a car repair shop, and joined the army together. Roan stood up and patted Mona and Michelle on the shoulders, grinning and asking, where are these three gentlemen now? It seems that they have not paid taxes on the $50,000. Let's go and have a brief discussion with them about the tax issue. Chapter 449 Arrest Operation. If one won't do, then two will do. Carson City, the capital of the federal state of Nevada, is located at the western foot of the Nevada mountains, 50 kilometers south of Reno, and northwest of Las Vegas. The city is mainly based on mining, agriculture, forestry, trade and other industries. There are the Nevada Mountain Ski Resort and Lake Tahoe tourist attractions on the west side of the city, and the scenery is very beautiful. However, the special investigation team led by Roan did not intend to enjoy the scenery when they arrived in Carson City this time. After getting off the car, they immediately contacted the local SWAT team and then went to a repair shop in the southern suburbs of Carson City. According to Mona's investigation, Daryl, Hubert and Pietro were staying at home at this time. Two black SUVs drove forward at a high speed, followed by a black troop carrier. Roan's SUV was in the middle. Chinal, who was sitting in the back seat, was carefully inspecting the equipment, while Mona, who was sitting in the co-pilot seat, bowed her head and typed on the keyboard. Following Winslow, who was driving in front, turning into another intersection, Roan asked, Mona, have you found any connection between Hubert and the three in the Odell family? After Hubert and the three were identified as suspects in the villa case last night, the special investigation team began to look for the reason why they committed the crime. Daryl with a big beard, Hubert with tattoos, and Pietro with a clean face, the three of them, and the Odell family are living in two different worlds. If nothing unexpected happens, in the capitalist country of the Federation, the lives of both parties may never intersect in this life. Because of the coquettish actions of Pranay Odell recorded in the notebook, Lassie had carefully searched for the connection between the Odell family and the three, trying to see if the Odell family had hurt them, or their relatives and friends. But a few hours later, the special investigation team checked all the records of Daryl and the three, since they were born, and found no connection with the Odell family, except that they occasionally bought some food sold by a food company under the Odell family. But if you kill the whole family because you are not happy with the food, I feel that this reason is really unreasonable. Sorry, we couldn't find it. Hearing Roan's question, Mona in the passenger seat shook her head and sighed. Chineer in the back seat saw this and said, we'll catch these three people and interrogate them, and we'll know the reason. Okay. Roan stopped asking questions and stepped on the accelerator to the bottom, rushing in front of Winslow's SUV. A few minutes later, three cars slowly stopped 2 streets outside the small apartment where Daryl and his two friends lived. 2 SWAT team members set off first to check the situation. Roan sat in the driver's seat, took out the Glock 18, and began to carefully check the equipment. The target person has been found. Soon, the voice of a SWAT team member rang out from the communicator on Luo An's chest. There is a target person in the living room on the 1st floor, and a target person in the left bedroom on the 2nd floor. Both of them have pistols. The remaining person has not been found yet. Luo An tilted his head to look at Mona. Mona frowned and quickly tapped the keyboard, and quickly replied, the street surveillance did not find anyone leaving. I can't find the details of the third person here. He is suspected to be in the basement. Okay. Time is urgent. Luo An didn't waste any words and directly pressed the communicator and said, the third person is suspected to be in the basement. The two target persons have weapons in their hands. Be careful when you act later, and focus on checking. Now, start the action. Understood. As soon as the voice fell, the door of the troop carrier was opened instantly, and a team of fully armed SWAT members holding explosion-proof shields, door-breaking hammers and rifles quickly moved towards the target apartment. The fully armed Luo An, Winslow, Lassie, and Chenier followed closely behind, while Mona and Michelle stayed in the car to check the situation and prepare for support. Separate actions. The apartment has two doors, front and back. Upon seeing this, the SWAT team members immediately split into two teams. One team went to the front door, and the other team prepared to block the back door. Just as the SWAT team members holding explosion-proof shields were about to arrive at the front door of the apartment, the SWAT team members responsible for observing the situation in the distance suddenly shouted in the communication device on their chests, "The target person in the bedroom on the second floor has been found. They are ready to attack." Luo An did not hesitate to hear this, and immediately waved his hand. "Break the door." Understood. The SWAT team members holding the door-breaking hammer quickly ran to the front door of the apartment, and without saying a word, they directly rammed the door hard. Boom. The ordinary wooden door was smashed in an instant, and the SWAT team members holding the door-breaking hammer quickly retreated. The SWAT team members holding the explosion-proof shield quickly stepped forward, lifted the explosion-proof shield, knocked down the door of the apartment, and broke into the apartment, while shouting loudly, "FBI! FBI! Put your hands up." Hubert, who was watching TV and drinking beer in the hall, was startled and subconsciously grabbed the pistol not far away from him, and prepared to attack. The SWAT team members holding blast shields did not hesitate to see this. They followed the action plan and raised their rifles to pull the trigger at Hubert's limbs. Bang, bang, bang. Hubert, who was shot, fell to the ground instantly. Roan said nothing. He waved to Winslow and others who rushed into the apartment from the back door to go upstairs and arrest people in the bedroom, and quickly walked to the door of the apartment basement. But Roan did not rush to go in directly, but took out two stun grenades from his waist. Chenier and Lass's mouths twitched when they saw this. Roan pretended not to see it and directly opened the door of the basement and threw two stun grenades in. The moment the stun grenades entered the basement, there was a curse from inside. "Fouquet." Boom. Boom. The next second, the stun grenade exploded and the sound of swearing disappeared instantly. Roan grinned, immediately opened the door, and rushed down the stairs. At the end of the basement steps, a white young man with a smear of black ash on his face was lying quietly on the ground. After taking out handcuffs and locking up the white youth, Roan handed him over to Lassie and Chanel, and then quickly left the basement and went to the second floor of the apartment. Bang, bang, bang. At this time, in the bedroom on the left side of the second floor of the apartment, Daryl, a bearded man, was constantly firing out, and Winslow and two SWAT members were leaning against the opposite side to avoid bullets. When he found something wrong, Daryl closed the curtains in order, and the two SWAT members outside who were responsible for observing the situation could no longer see the situation in the bedroom. "Son of Eat." Hearing the explosion of the stun grenade from downstairs, Winslow, who cursed Daryl in a low voice, grinned and immediately took out a stun grenade from his waist. Since joining the special investigation team, Chanel and Winslow began to carry a few stun grenades on their waists every time they went out on a mission. Seeing this scene, Mona and Lassie were very speechless, while Roan smiled and nodded repeatedly, and there was someone to take over. Winslow took out a stun grenade and threw it directly in the direction of the bedroom on the left. Shit. In the bedroom, Daryl, who was thinking about how to escape, had his pupils shrank. While greeting Winslow, he quickly picked up a magazine of a girl who was not wearing much clothes on the table next to him, and knocked the stun grenade away from the bedroom. Boom. A flash of white light passed by, and the stun grenade exploded in the corridor, and the magazine instantly turned into fragments on the ground. Daryl breathed a sigh of relief. Just as he got up from the ground, he suddenly found that there were two more stun grenades flying towards him in the air. "Daryl, I asterisk ash." Boom. Boom. The next second, 2 stun grenades exploded. Daryl only felt a flash of white light in front of his eyes, and then he was pressed on by several people and his hands were handcuffed. If one is not enough, use 2. At the staircase on the 2nd floor, Roan patted Winslow, who was dazed, and laughed, then turned and walked towards the basement. Chanel just called Roan loudly, saying that she found something in the basement. Chapter 450, Interrogation, the roles of Petro and the other 2 in the case. In the southern suburbs of Carson City, in the basement of an apartment. Previously, he was busy going upstairs to catch people, and did not observe the basement carefully. This time, following Chanel's call, he returned to the basement, and observed carefully, while going down the stairs. Colorful induction lights, speakers, projectors, computers with several screens, computer chairs with flashing lights on the back. The decoration of the basement looks very high-tech. Even the toilet paper on the bedside not far away is clamped in a flashing box. However, the colorful lights are too flashy, which makes Roan a little annoyed. He reached out to turn on the lighting on the wall, walked to Chanel and asked, "What did you find?" "Petro's laptop." Chanel handed Roan a thick suitcase with a laptop inside. Chanel said that she just found that Petro had hidden it in the wooden interlayer under the bed. After finding it, Chanel found that it was still a little warm to the touch, which means that Petro must have used this computer before they came here. But when he heard our FBI voice, Petro's first reaction was to hide it, so there must be something wrong with this laptop. Roan laughed, nodded with satisfaction, patted Chenia's arm, and signaled her and Lassie to deal with the scene, take away everything in the room, then turned and left the basement and handed the laptop to Mona. Next to the SUV, Mona took the suitcase Roan handed her, opened it and her eyes lit up. "Wow, it's actually a laptop assembled by myself." Roan was a little surprised. "Homemade?" Mona turned around and went to the SUV to get her own laptop and data cable, saying, "Yes, the guy who assembled this computer is a talent, but I don't know if he installed his own program in the system. For example, a firewall, or if the login password is entered incorrectly, it will explode and self-destruct immediately. This computer is handed over to you." After entrusting the laptop to Mona, Roan waited for Lassie and Chenia to finish dealing with the scene, and then called the Carson City FBI branch to temporarily borrow an office and several interrogation rooms. Roan didn't know much about computer technology, but he was very experienced in interrogation. In the interrogation room on the far left, Roan and Chanel pushed the door open. The first person they interrogated was Petro, a 23-year-old young man. "Good afternoon." Entering the interrogation room, Chanel sat on a chair with a gloomy face, took out a small notebook, and began to record the conversation. Roan put a cup of coffee in front of Petro, sat sideways on the interrogation table, and asked with a smile, "This is your first time being arrested by the FBI. How do you feel?" "Not very good." Perhaps it was because he had been squatting in the basement without seeing the sun for many years. Petro's skin was morbidly pale. Looking up at Roan in front of him, Petro swallowed his saliva, snorted coldly, and said, "I want to find a lawyer. I won't say anything before the lawyer arrives." "You are really a young man." Roan laughed out loud when he heard this, and clapped his hands. Petro raised the corner of his mouth when he saw this, and was about to speak when Roan suddenly put away the smile on his face, and instantly replaced it with an extremely serious and gloomy expression. He stared at Petro, and said in a firm voice, "Do you really think that a lawyer will be helpful in doing what you have done?" Petro was startled by the speed of Roan's face change and expression. He swallowed and was about to speak, but Roan sneered, stood up and walked behind Petro, saying as he walked, "Your desktop computer and the laptop are now in our hands. There are many computer experts in the FBI. Who do you think has better skills, yours or his?" Hearing the word coming from behind him, Petro lowered his head, his face gloomy. Seeing this, Roan regained his smile, and said to Petro with a smile, "Since you want to wait for a lawyer, then wait. But I remind you, if we open your computer first and find evidence in it, we may not interrogate you later." "Wait a minute." Petro's forehead was sweating when he heard this. Seeing Roan preparing to leave the interrogation room while talking, He finally lost his temper and said loudly, "I can answer your questions, but I want an immunity agreement." "No, 3 immunity agreements. Impossible." Roan spread his hands. "I guess you have guessed why we arrested the 3 of you. You killed so many people, it is impossible to get an immunity agreement." "No, we didn't kill those people." Petro's eyes widened when he heard this, and his face was full of anger and said, "You are framing us. We didn't do those things at all." Chenille looked up at Petro calmly. Roan's heart moved slightly, but his expression did not change. He continued to say expressionlessly, "All criminals will not admit what they have done at the beginning." Fouquet. Petro hammered the interrogation table hard, and after a few seconds of silence, he raised his head, stared at Roan, and said, "We really didn't kill those people. I can tell you everything, but I want 3 plea agreements." Plea agreements and exoneration agreements are both federal legal provisions. Plea agreements apply to defendants in criminal cases, whether it is murder, robbery, drug trafficking or economic crimes. As long as the plea agreement is signed, the defendant can obtain a series of benefits such as commutation of sentence, probation, exemption from prosecution or reduction of criminal responsibility. At present, only you are willing to tell the story, so only 1 plea agreement can be signed. Roan hesitated for a few seconds and agreed. Petro nodded helplessly. An hour later, the agreement was signed. Petro took a sip of the coffee on the table and frowned. "This matter is actually an order we received in the online world." Petro said that the website was an underground crime website, which was full of various illegal and criminal activities. Petro did not dare to touch black crime orders such as murder and robbery, exclusive product trading, etc. Daryl and Hubert did not want to touch them, so the 3 of them had always only taken some grey orders in it. As time went by, the website developed faster, black crime orders increased, and grey orders naturally decreased. The lives of Petro and the other 2 began to become difficult. Some time ago, when Petro was thinking about what to do in the future, if he left the website, he suddenly found a grey order, which contained the content of stealing something from a villa. The employer who placed the order said that he had already investigated the structure of the villa, the staffing arrangements, the activities of the villa that day, etc. And the only thing missing was someone to steal those things, so the 3 of us took the order. At this point, Petro cursed under his breath, and then continued, "According to the employer's plan and the information given to me, I first established a good relationship with a guy named Henry on the internet. With the money given to us by the employer, I bribed Henry to pretend to be sick that night and ask his mother to go home. Then the employer will send another woman he found to take over the role of Henry's mother that night, enter the villa, and drug everyone's food. Then the 3 of us sneaked into the villa and stole those things." Hearing this, Luo An frowned slightly and asked, "You said that the employer asked the woman to drug everyone, so why did everyone in the villa die?" End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.